Next-gen trash talk heats up. Nintendo and Sega trapped by strong yen. And CD-ROM can't pay the rent. These stories and many more on this episode of the Video Game Newsroom Time Machine.
I've been waiting a long time for a chance to say this. Stop the presses.
Requiescat in pace.
Makes him crazy, man. What is a man?
It's me, Mario.
What a mess.
Get over here!
Please save me.
Welcome back to the Video Game Newsroom Time Machine, the show where we travel back in time to find out what was making headlines in the home computer and video game industries of yesteryear. I'm your host, Carl, and I'm joined again by everybody's favorite co-host, Alex.
Happy to be here.
Yay! So, before we can turn on the time machine and head back 30 years to November of 1993, there's the obligatory podcast banter. And, this time I'm not going to throw it to you because I need to announce a death.
Oh.
Yes. Possibly the longest running game magazine on the planet, Spain's Micromania, which was just a few months shy of turning 39, has been canceled. The last issue, issue 335 of the third era of the magazine, which had just hit stores a few weeks ago. We're recording this on the 24th of January 2024, was unceremoniously post-release announced as the final issue of Micromania. So, I'll be honest with you, this entire week has just been, there's a certain malaise hanging over me. As anyone who's been listening to the show for a while knows, that was my go-to magazine as a kid. That was the one that really got me into the idea of the games industry. And while I haven't read it regularly for years, just due to lack of access primarily, the one time I went to Spain a few years ago for a weekend, the first thing I had to do was hit a newsstand, and I picked up a copy of Micromania. It's still on my shelf behind me. But yeah, so it has fallen. Sad, sad news. Sorry. Just had to mention that.
No, I understand.
Yeah.
Yeah, a dying breed.
Sadly.
The print magazine.
Yeah, I mean, it's future generations. I don't know how we're going to look back and put things in perspective with websites disappearing or not giving a chronological archive to search through and so forth. I mean, what we're doing here on the show is going to become very, very difficult for people 20 or 30 years from now.
Mm-hmm. No, that's very true, and is something that I constantly worry about. There were websites out there, and I really hope that, news websites, and I really hope that at some point some organization starts being more diligent about completely scraping those. And I don't mean what the Internet Archive captures. Obviously, the Internet Archives captures quite a bit, and it's great that it's out there, but it's not all of that usable, to just, I mean, if you're looking for a specific thing, you kind of can, but if you just want the wide swath, if you want to just be like, I wonder what the news was in November 2023, then it can be really hard sometimes to make use of that. And of course, they don't quite capture everything when you're talking about a news site. Not necessarily every article gets captured, because these sources of information still exist, but the problem is with them being on websites, there's no sense of permanence. There's no sense that this will last. It needs to be archived in an accessible manner, as opposed to just let's just scrape the whole internet manner. Though obviously no shade being thrown on Internet Archive, which is amazing.
Of course. Yeah, and, once I start doing what is now our 20-year jump again, when we finally get to the end of the 10 years, I'm thinking we might have to pick that up again. That we're going to hit a point in the early 2000s when the number of print sources is going to dwindle down to almost nothing. And so, yeah, it's sad. But yeah, so, oh well, enough commiserating about the present. Let's commiserate about the past. So, okay, everybody, you know the standard drill. When we're talking about November of 1993, we're always looking at the cover dates of magazines and newspaper articles. So obviously the news happened at some point before that. This is just a framing device. Don't send me emails about that, but you can send me emails about everything else at videogamenewsroomtimemachine@gmail.com. Links to that, all the social media, as well as our Patreon, where for just $1 a month you can join in. We currently have 2 extra interview episodes up online that have not hit the general feed yet. One is our conversation with S.M. Oliva, the absolutely amazing blogger, about his work looking back at the television show The Computer Chronicles. We go through the history of that show. And also my interview with William Folk, who is an amazing industry veteran, tons of great stories. His conversation in the early 90s with one John Carmack about which console he should support in the 32-bit generation. It's beautiful quote, absolutely wonderful. That is also up there for early access, as well, of course, as the over 80 video versions of our segment, The 7 Minutes in Heaven. And remember, it's not what you hear here just with pictures. It's actual playthrough with our commentary. So fun stuff, lots to pick up on. And the
don't make my inept gameplay be in vain. Support and watch.
Very, very true. So, 7 Minutes in Heaven, the segment of our show where our intrepid co-hosts must play a game that they have never played before, that was reviewed in a publication dated November of 1993. We had some amazing titles. We had Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles Tournament Fighter, Clay Fighter. Kind of think maybe fighting games are popular at this point in time. Who knew? We have the beginning of a dynasty. We had FIFA International Soccer on the Genesis. Hell, you could have even played the DOS version of Street Fighter 2. Now, that is torture. The CD-ROM extravaganza returned to Zork. Or, of course, some Amiga classics like Turrican 3 or Amber Moon. But no, you decided to go with a Genesis classic, which I'm still amazed. I know you were a Super NES kid, but still, that you had never played this. Aladdin for the Genesis.
Yeah, that's right. I have played the Super Nintendo version, which I know is completely different. I'm a historian. I know that one's Capcom and one's Virgin and David Perry and all his people. So I have played an Aladdin video game of the era, but not this Aladdin video game.
Well then, in that case, let us rectify that horrid error. And are you ready?
Let's do it. Or no, cut that out. As you wish.
Get this! At school I found this magic lamp, and I wished for Disney's Aladdin for my Sega Genesis. It's like the movie! I got to battle sword-slashing thieves, and nasty palace guards, and ride a flying carpet. And I still have 2 more wishes.
Prove it!
Sega Genesis and Disney's Aladdin game cartridge, each sold separately.
Welcome back, Alex, from your 7 minutes in heaven. So, for the uninitiated, how would you describe Aladdin on the Genesis based on your 7 minutes with the game?
Well, it seems to me that it is a platform game taking place within the world of Disney's Aladdin. I can't really put it any simpler than that.
Well, it seems like a simple enough explanation of it.
Yes. And to elaborate just a little bit, of course, it is the Genesis version, which was done by Virgin Games and Dave Perry, as opposed to the Super Nintendo version, which was done by Capcom. And so they have a lot of similarities, including in a lot of the gameplay mechanics, but very different implementations.
Now, since you have experience with both of the games, obviously the Super NES experience is a little bit in your past. What would you say are the most obvious differences, and how would let's just start with the differences.
Well, first of all, I do appreciate that the Genesis game does not treat the enemies as Goombas. You get a sword and you can slash at them instead of jumping on their heads, which makes a little more sense in context. I mean, it's executed well enough in the SNES game. It just feels a bit silly. That's the biggest gameplay difference, because you have apples in both. You can throw at things. You're collecting a lot of the same things. The platforming in general principle is similar, but you do get that sword. In terms of the presentation, of course, the animation is stunning. That's the thing that it is known for above all else. The depth of color and depth of shading, it's a lot flatter than the SNES version, because of course the SNES can display more colors, but just the fluidity of the animation, it does very much remind me of Jordan Mechner's work and like Prince of Persia or Eric Chahi's work on Another World. It has kind of that same level of fluidity going for it. Unfortunately, because of that animation fluidity, it does lose a little something in the responsiveness of the controls, and the timing often felt really odd to me. Now, I am not a platforming game master, but I mean, I can get through World 1-1 of Super Mario Brothers. Thank you very much. So, I mean, it's not like I've never jumped a platform before in my life, and it just feels like the timings are a little off, and I think it's because of how many frames are needed for those animations. So it has its good points versus the SNES version, and it has its inferior points versus the SNES version.
That is definitely something I would say is a very valid criticism. As someone who was fascinated by the game when I first saw it, but obviously didn't own a console to play it on, did think it was very interesting. Now, this version of the game, this Genesis version, got ported to a ton of systems. So there's a Game Boy port, then they ported a game to the Game Boy Color, and it's not just a colorized version, they reprogrammed it again. There's an NES port of this. There is a Amiga, AGA Amiga, doesn't run on standard Amigas. That was much to my chagrin at the time. There's a DOS port of this. I mean, it's kind of weird. The Super NES version only gets the Super NES port. And well, no, it also gets a Game Boy Advance port years later that better not speak of it because, well, there isn't a lot of screen real estate for those sprites. But yeah, it's interesting that this game seems to have just taken on a life of its own and has a mythical status to this day.
Yeah, and I think a lot of that, and this isn't to make light of people who enjoyed it, because I can see that it'd be a very enjoyable game, and it's not like you had the SNES version if you were a Genesis owner, but I do think a lot of that was due to the amount of marketing that was done around it, and to the same effect that you described as being there at the time. It's like you see the game, and it just blows you away, and you've got to have it. Then, and I don't know, I mean, since I wasn't a Genesis owner, I don't claim to speak for Genesis owners, but I imagine some of those people then, when they got it home and actually played it, probably felt it was a little sluggish, especially since Genesis owners in general were used to Genesis games being less sluggish than their SNES counterparts because it had that Motorola 68000. I don't know exactly how the Sonic player would really respond when they got this game home, and it was a little slower and a little less responsive. I mean, they might have responded great. When I say I don't know, it's not a rhetorical question. I really don't know. But I think that's an interesting contrast to bring up.
Well, definitely. And I think also if you look at the assortment of platform games on the Genesis at the time, with the exception, obviously, of Sonic, which is a very different type of platformer in that sense, a game that was really going to have that slower pace, where do I go now type of gameplay, you didn't really have that much quality to choose from on the Genesis. There were plenty of those games, but I mean, really high quality ones were kind of far in between at this point. We still don't have, Konami hasn't released Hardcore or Castlevania Bloodlines or any of that on the Genesis yet, at least not in the West. Don't know what the release schedule is like in Japan. But yeah, it's one of those things where if you're a Genesis owner, this is the shiznat. And it looks so pretty. So, would you recommend players today give Aladdin on the Genesis a try?
I would. If you're a fan of platforming games, I think it's worth trying out. Just know that the controls responsiveness may be a little janky, but come for the fluid animations. I mean, if you like things like Prince of Persia or Another World especially, you'll get some appreciation out of Genesis Aladdin.
Excellent. Well then, with that glowing recommendation, it's time to check in with our last stop before we turn on that time machine, and that is to check in with our good friend Ethan to find out what we got wrong in our October of 1993 jump in a little section we call the Department of Corrections.
Hello, this is a prepaid collect call from
the Department of Corrections.
This call is subject to recording and monitoring. To accept charges, press 1. You may start the conversation now.
Welcome back, Ethan. So, I guess before we can check out everything that I got wrong in our October of 1993 jump, it's time for...
Is it time for? Is it ever time? Are we in time? We're outside of time here in the Video Game Newsroom Time Machine.
This is true. We are just jumping and skipping and doing what we want. So
yeah, I do not have the comment for right now because I just kind of roll all the main things into my discussions and corrections, as this is the Department of Corrections here for October 1993. Carl, yeah. I can see the guilt in your face. Let me wrench it out of you.
Okay, wrench away.
All right, just like the Mario Brothers, and plumbing's our game, and blah, 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 and all that stuff, yeah.
Yeah. Insert whatever joke you want to make about wrenches and nuts right here. So, let's do it.
So, first off, you were, I forget what, you were talking about some asymmetrical multiplayer game.
Yeah.
I can't remember if this is Amiga or something like that.
Oh, no, yeah. We were talking about Hired Guns because that was the 7 Minutes in Heaven game for the month.
Okay. So when you were talking about that, the first thing that came to mind was Don't Talking and Nobody Explodes in VR. Because I believe you brought up something about this would be good in VR. And I think that's basically what Don't Talking and Nobody Explodes is.
Okay. Well, yeah, we were talking about Space Team. Which I found out after the episode that has now been ported to VR. So there is now a VR version of Space Team, which, wow, I totally want to play that. But I am not familiar with Don't Walking and No One Explodes.
Yeah, Don't Talk and Nobody Explodes is a bomb defusal game where one person has the manual and then they have to talk to the person who's in the VR headset to make sure that it doesn't blow up.
Okay, that sounds like a very, very similar concept. Yeah. For a moment there, I thought it was going to be like press red to not die. Are you familiar with that game?
No, but it sounds like a basic Flash game in which that is the premise.
Oh no, it's a fantastic B-movie FMV game. It's straight up FMV Dragon's Lair gameplay style, but with live actors, and it's this entire absolutely stupid first-person perspective B-movie as a Laserdisc game. Yeah, it's absolutely purposely hilarious.
I'll take your word for it.
Yeah, it's fun. Okay.
Then we go to, you were discussing about DMA design, and sorry to say, Carl, the no such thing as what Grand Theft Auto eventually became was under development in 1993.
When did they start with the Cops and Robbers game?
It was 1995, I believe, because this was when they were part of Nintendo's development efforts. GTA was started as a side project while they were working on Body Harvest for the N64.
Gotcha. Okay, yeah, that makes sense.
So it's either 94 or 95 that they started. We have a dated document of the Cops and Robbers thing, which is from 95.
Gotcha, okay. Yeah, it makes sense. I was off a little bit. About a year and a half. So, okay, yeah. I take
Then Sega's amusement park arcade places are not Joyopolis, they are Joypolis.
Okay. That's harder to pronounce.
Welcome to Japan.
Yep. Okay. Joypolis.
In fact, in Japanese, it would be Joyopolis, something like that.
So they would actually say Joyo. So there would be another
because they don't
vowel
have
sound.
Yeah.
Okay.
But
so my instinct was right. The spelling is what throws me off here.
I mean, in English, they spell it Joypolis. So
gotcha. Okay.
That is what you must say.
I will say Joypolis.
And then back to our favorite subject, the Nintendo CD player. They never promised it would be CDI compatible.
Actually, no. That's the news reports, as we reported on them here on the show, said that they would be able to run CDI discs.
Okay.
Yeah, that was actually what was in the news reports when the Philips thing was announced.
Okay.
Yeah.
Then you shall stand on this one, Carl.
Yeah. Sorry. Yeah, that's why the whole back and forth was so entertaining. But yeah. Just imagine being able to play Voyeur on a Nintendo product. It's almost like, playing, I don't know, Night Trap on a Nintendo product. That'll never happen. Sorry.
Make sure to watch our breakdown of the Senate hearings as well, in which you will get to hear that famous line said.
Yes.
And on to Nintendo's next system. The N64, it should have been ready in 1995. In fact, they announced it was ready at the beginning of 1995, but there were issues that ultimately led it to not be released in 1995.
Do we know what those issues were?
There is a collection of there are variable reports on that. Howard Lincoln has said that it was the lack of software products, which is ironic, of course, because it launched with 2 games. So there's that.
It would have launched with 1 game. Yeah.
Yeah. Other reports, there were some engineering things that kind of need to be worked out. I didn't get that impression from the people that I talked to at Silicon Graphics that they weren't, it was a tough development project. But it could have happened. It could have been a manufacturing thing. One way or another, they were like, in January, they said at November 1995 they'd launch it, and it took until April 96 in Japan and June in the US.
Gotcha. Yeah. Yeah, I just I remember it being delayed. I that they, I guess we'll get to that when we get to it, that they're actually going to announce that it'll be ready for launch in 95. When do they announce the launch in 95? Do they announce it in 95 or do they say in...
in January 1995, they say we're done. It's going to be out in November.
Okay, gotcha.
This is something I've tracked very closely. I have a whole article on the N64 you can read on my blog or on Gaming Alexandria.
Cool. I'll put a link in the show notes.
Hooray. And more Nintendo. One thing that's worth noting about Nintendo's games that they published, I forget exactly where this was in the conversation, but a lot of those were not internally developed. We still don't know the full extent of what was not made by Nintendo, what was made by people like Intelligent Systems and SRD, which, kind of was simpatico, but at the same time, technically not Nintendo. And that factors into the fact that Nintendo had such a low employee count, which allowed them to become the biggest Japanese company by earnings by employee.
Gotcha. And that's, I think we mentioned it a little bit. I mean, that they hadn't really expanded considering how large the company was and the demands on it. So, yeah, but it's interesting that a lot of their internal development, I mean, nowadays, when a game was done by Namco for them or something, but back then they were keeping it very much on the down low that the stuff wasn't being made internally.
And that was not unique to them. Tosei Software is the most famous case of a quote-unquote secret developer.
Gotcha.
So a lot of
they do work for?
A whole lot of companies, mainly Japanese. There were a couple Broderbund titles that they did. You can look it up. It's on GDRI, the Game Developer Research Institute. They have a whole wiki about different things. But because it's completely secret what games that they worked on, they are not allowed to say. So people have done code digging to figure out, this was made by Tosei.
Interesting.
The entire development apparatus behind the Japanese Famicom is a whole subject in itself that I think very few people realize.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's so much of what was going on in the Japanese market was black boxed. I mean, you didn't really get to see inside of there. And I mean, you could still say that even today, looking inside a Nintendo is a very tough deal.
Yeah, but not that it's nearly as much in Japan. I mean, if you go on Shmuplations, you can see all these translated interviews that were done back in the day. They told you stuff. They maybe didn't tell you all the gritty, nitty details that you wanted to know. People talked more in terms of artistic ideals rather than the specific realities of the development process. But there was considerable stuff known back then. It's just it hasn't been translated until very recently.
That's true. Yeah,
as you're getting into this part of the the history, that whole apparatus is starting to just not be able to keep up because their big thing is that, especially something like Tosei, they were able to churn out stuff super fast. It's just like Rare. Rare may have had a slightly better quality to what they were doing, but in general, they made these very small projects very quickly, and now we're getting to the point that you can't do that. It's not going to be competitive.
That's true. That is very, very true. I mean, yeah, game development is just getting too big. Still not as big as it's going to get, but yeah.
Yes. There are many moments at which, the production quality kind of goes up, and in different areas. I was talking about this with Alex a little bit, especially where in computer games it started to go up and up. Something like Summer Games on the Commodore 64, and then Path of Radiance on DOS. There's just these big expansions of what the games require in order to get out.
Yeah, you mean Pool of Radiance.
Pool of Radiance, yes.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, just the size of the teams keeps getting bigger. The quality of the animation that's being demanded gets bigger. And Then you get to Wing Commander, and all hell breaks loose with what people are expecting the games to look like.
Though the first Wing Commander was not that big of a production.
No, it wasn't, but it still looked so much better than everything else that was on the market. That, just the cutscene animations, the extra mission briefings, the synchronized mouth movements to the words. It was just so richer and cooler looking than anything that had come before it, that I think a lot of people underestimated how much you could do with a relatively small group of people, as far as the art team and so forth is concerned. As long as you're in 3D and manipulating stuff, if you're doing 2D games and you have to compete with Wing Commander, all those background images that you used to be able to do with one or two people, now you need whole teams of artists to do them. And I think, and
so this is my way of sneaking onto the podcast here to do commentary. But just keep in mind that we're at a point where the production of games is changing, and we're going to get there again when we get to the 3D era.
Oh, definitely, yes.
Then, next, E3, as we talk about E3, which is not in this time period, I forget the context, but E3, it was never a place to meet developers. Because most of the time, developers were not on the show floor. If they were there just to, be a representative of the company to sell the product. PAX, though, you can meet developers.
Very true, very true.
Or GDC, but that's, you have to be a person in the industry to get into there.
Yeah. I mean, GDC is a whole different ballgame. That's for the developers. Yeah.
And very expensive, but I got there for free.
That would be something I'd like to visit at some point. Not sure how I'd get in, maybe a press ticket. But, yeah. Probably most of it would go over my head.
GDC is still fun. I'll tell you that much. But let's not dwell on that. Maybe I'll tell that story someday. But the final note on here is just a complete opinion piece that has nothing to do with corrections. But in my opinion, the Mortal Kombat movie is a 5 out of 10.
5 out of 10 today, or 5 out of 10 at the time of release?
I didn't watch it at the time of release, so I got nothing there. And I'm not invested in Mortal Kombat the slightest bit. Just as a note there. So whatever changes they made, it's just kind of, it's a stilted action movie to me, but it's not offensive.
A very, very fair assessment. And I view it as someone who saw it on opening weekend with a bit of a tinted glasses, as someone who was very much into Mortal Kombat at the time. And it was hokey. We knew that, but it gave us on the big screen the energy that we felt when playing the game. At least that was the perception at the time. It probably has not aged well.
But that will be all for October of 1993. Carl, you can remove your rose-tinted glasses and go back even further in time, yet again, and look into the distant horizon and imagine what tomorrow may bring.
Oh, very, very nicely said. So, okay, that wasn't too bad. Oh, then, Ethan, as always, we thank you for your service, and we shall see you next time.
Boy?
I mean, I'm definitely with you there, Carl. I mean, when I as we talked about in the episode, I did not and still have not seen Mortal Kombat, but I have seen the movies of the time. I mean, when what we were getting was the Super Mario Brothers movie and Street Fighter 2, which I loved to death, but for all the wrong reasons. Mortal Kombat, to my understanding, was truly a breath of fresh air in the landscape. And I think it's one of those movies that you can't completely divorce from the time. Let's not go all postmodern on this. You cannot divorce that movie from the time it was released in terms of its acceptance amongst video game players.
All I have to say is the opening, the very, very opening of the movie, the opening credits, it just starts with a giant ball of flame coming up through the holes in the symbol, and you hear the techno remix of Mortal Kombat. And everybody in the theater basically was just like, "Yes!" We thought we were the kid in the advertisement, for Mortal Monday. We were so excited. But yes, I think we know what the next watch along is going to be for the show.
Oh boy!
Mortal Kombat the movie upon its anniversary, which is still a little ways away. But
then we gotta contrast it with Street Fighter 2. Then not in the same episode, but then we have to do, if we're doing a Mortal Kombat watch, we have to do a Street Fighter 2 watch.
This is what Patreon is for. We can't post it on YouTube, but we can put it on Patreon. Wink, wink, nudge, nudge. Those who haven't jumped on board, remember you can go to YouTube or the Patreon to watch our 3+ hour watch along and comment along of the congressional hearings on violence, which we'll be talking about next month.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, this is the kind of extra cool stuff that we can do on Patreon. So,
because let me tell you, no matter how bad and cheesy a movie is, and let's not have any illusions about Street Fighter 2, it is impossible to have too much Raul Julia.
You are 100% correct, especially on a Tuesday. No. Okay, so now we're done with all the formalities. Let's turn on the time machine and head back 30 years to November of 1993.
Kid to point a gun at a television set.
Welcome back to November of 1993. Alex, what's our first headline?
AMOA shows little promise for street ops.
The premier North American coin-op show, the AMOA, had little in the way of new games for operators placing machines in so-called street locations like bars and convenience stores. With the exception of Mortal Kombat 2 and Super Street Fighter 2, most of the new hardware was geared to arcades with bigger cabinets, sit-down units, and extremely expensive hardware. Virtua Fighter, Ridge Racer, Cyber Sled, and Air Combat set the tone in next-gen graphics, while VR offerings from Visions of Reality, Alternate Worlds Technology, and VR8 all failed to impress both from a software and headgear standpoint.
Yeah, I mean, there's clearly two trends going on here. One is the obvious trend that everybody talks about. Consoles are so much more sophisticated now, and so you have to figure out a way to stand out from home games. And that means having large cabinets with funny controllers and big screens and all of that stuff. But I think the other thing that doesn't necessarily get talked about as much, but we have certainly been referencing the last few 90s jumps on this show, is I think the fighting game, as successful as it was, really went a long way towards killing the street location. Because street locations like having games around as a way to pick up some spare change, to get a few people coming in that may not otherwise come in, that play a game for a bit, then get a soda and leave or whatever. But I don't think they wanted the fighting game crowd. We've talked recently about 7-Eleven getting rid of the games, for instance. I don't think they wanted that crowd, because then you get people that are coming to show up for these rivalries. I mean, there are many, many people that went down to their local 7-Eleven or a 7-Eleven a few neighborhoods over to challenge other people to fighting games. And there was this kind of rivalry, and that could sometimes turn quite visceral, not just be on the game, in these kind of fighting games. And I think street locations were starting to turn away from video games in part because of that. And then, of course, as street locations started to turn away, the manufacturers started making fewer games tailored to those locations.
And I think you're 100% correct. And there's also another factor, which is it's a distraction for the kids while the parents are doing something. And let's face it, that quarter is not going to last you very long in Street Fighter unless you've really, really gotten good at it, especially when now you're getting into Super Street Fighter 2. I mean, I've considered myself a halfway decent Street Fighter 2 player back in the day. I don't survive one or the second. Sometimes I'll get past the second bout in Super Street Fighter 2 in the normal setting. I mean, you can obviously, as the operator, change the settings. They're tailoring it to a more and more hardcore crowd, whereas the old days used to be if there was a really good player there and you were playing Double Dragon, well, that guy is actually going to let the other player, the second player, get more out of their quarter. So it's gone from the players versus the machine to the players versus the players. And yeah, you're right. It's just creating a more hostile environment than what you would have had in the glory days of Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles or The Simpsons. You know,
absolutely.
4 kids all putting in money one after the other to see what comes next, as opposed to one kid just beating the crap out of everybody else.
Right. And in an arcade setting, that's fine. But convenience stores don't want fights breaking out between rival gangs. And I mean, I don't use gangs in necessarily a criminal sense, so sometimes even that, because while there's always been this kind of panic around games attracting these ne'er-do-wells, the fact is fighting games did attract these kind of rivalries where people, you know, once a person was the best in their neighborhood, they would go find another neighborhood where they could try to dominate, and they were not always welcome in this new neighborhood. David Craddock did a great book. It's the first in a trilogy, but a great book on the first few Mortal Kombat games. And what was great about it is he didn't only talk to the developers, but he talked to a lot of the players at the time and documented their experiences. And it really is quite interesting how, I'm not sure the right word to use, but how hostile, I guess the word you used is the best one to use, how hostile these player interactions could become on these fighting games, especially when you left your home turf to challenge someone else on their home turf.
Of course. So, yeah. And obviously here also we're starting to see this move to 3D graphics, which in many ways is also going to change the economics of this, because we've seen that the big money is to be made in the home conversions. That's why Acclaim lost the rights to Mortal Kombat. Why, and we'll talk about it in the next story as well, some of these home makers want to get into the arcade so they have the properties to convert back. Again, Acclaim and so forth. But the 3D graphics right now, I mean, a game like Virtua Fighter, at this point in time, there's no way of converting that back to the home. We've already had previews of Virtua Racer for the Genesis in some of the magazines, but these games are getting more and more complex. The question is going to be, can you make back your development costs solely off of the arcade cabinet if there's no home hardware that can reproduce them?
That's fine, Carl. We'll just make an add-on that can handle this new type of games on our Genesis. That'll be great.
Yeah, add-ons have worked so great so far. Oh, well.
But yes, to your point, as you say, this is a really weird time in arcade game, coin-op game history, because even as the market is about to go into an irreversible decline in the United States, you have the console companies that aren't in tune with the economics of coin-op. All they know is the hits have come from there in the past. Surely the hits are going to come from there in the future, and they don't really know or understand what's going on in that business. Coming in at just this moment when it's the absolute worst time to get in. And that's why EA beefs up coinop efforts.
Electronic Arts is beefing up its coinop division. They already have industry veteran Steve Kaufman, and now they've nabbed Konami's Frank Pellegrini. According to Kaufman, they have several games in the works, and the 3DO will no doubt become a coin-op platform, not just for EA, but for other manufacturers as well. Yeah. To say that this is not going to happen is a bit of an understatement.
That is very true. Very, very true. But of course, EA is trying to sell this every which way because they are still in some kind of semi-vague alliance with 3DO around the console. Much more vague than Trip Hawkins would like at this point, believe me.
Oh yeah,
he will tell you about that. So yeah, of course that never happens, but it is in their interests to try to make that happen. Obviously, but yeah, I mean. It made, obviously, all of these companies hire coin-op veterans to run their divisions. Kaufman and Pellegrini here, and Acclaim gets Tom Pettit, longtime Sega, and John Passierb, who started at Midway back in the 70s, to run theirs. They're getting the right people to run the divisions themselves, but they just... If they were actually in tune with the business at all before starting these divisions, they would realize this is just not the time, because we're getting to the point where you don't need to have the great arcade conversions. You can actually make home console properties that people will buy as well that aren't just role-playing games. Not that people in the U.S. were buying role-playing games at this point, but...
Well, the example was right in front of them, and Ninja Gaiden.
Yeah.
If you looked at the arcade game, you looked at what they did for the home, or Strider, well, to a lesser extent, on the NES. But any of these games where, when they made it to the home, got a whole new level of depth.
Rygar is another one, even though it's a little more obscure.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I played plenty of Rygar back in the day, but it's one of those things where the depth that's expected from home games is growing. The expectations are different, and so the arcade is going to just be a place to show off really cool high-tech stuff, the 3D games. And I almost get a feeling from reading this article, it's coming from Playmeter magazine, that they're almost hoping the 3DO as a platform is going to be a cheap way for them to get into this high-end arcade thing, and it's already way too late because the 3DO is not capable of keeping up with what Sega's putting into their hardware, what Namco's putting into their hardware.
Exactly, and they have the right idea there, because the jump to 3D is making it too expensive for most of the coin-op companies. The companies that are having success there, like Sega and Namco, are the ones that are able to forge deals with American defense contractors and do really advanced hardware stuff, and you're getting to a point where you're going to really have some have and have-nots. And of course, this is ultimately finally solved with everyone just switching to PC hardware a couple of decades down the line. But the instincts are correct here that there needs to be some kind of universal, easily adaptable platform. Of course, Namco and Sony will collaborate on the System 22 as well, which is PlayStation-based, which has some drawbacks compared to their most advanced hardware, but, kind of works. We're moving in that direction, but 3DO ain't the platform to do it on.
No, definitely not. So, but hey, it's not just EA that's getting into the coin-op biz.
That's right. Nintendo returns to coin-op.
Just about a year after exiting the coin-op space, as we reported here, Nintendo has announced that they will return in 1994 with games using their Project Reality hardware at their yearly trade show in Japan.
Of course, everything we have just said is all lies. All lies. Nintendo doesn't really return to coin-op. They make deals with companies like Midway to release N64 games in coin-op forms, and believe me, those games do not use the Project Reality hardware. They will continue to say they use the Project Reality hardware, and it is all lies. I'm sure they can get away with it from an advertising perspective because some little part of it is similar, but it is all lies, and there is a lot more RAM in there too, let me tell you.
Oh, yeah. And, I mean, we're really only talking about 2 games here. We're talking about Killer Instinct, developed by Rare, which is just pre-rendered sprites on a slightly moved background. And the other game is Cruisin' USA, which, I mean, I'm sorry. If I see a Cruisin' USA machine, I will always put a quarter in that thing. I love that game.
Oh, no, it's a great game, but it does not use Project Reality hardware.
Oh, hell no. Anybody who's played the N64 conversion of that can attest that those are 2 very different platforms. I mean, I've played Final Fight on a C64. Does not mean that it's the same damn game.
Yes, but in that case, they never really claimed it was. I mean, I'm sure there might have been back-of-the-box copy that says, bring the hit arcade game home, but they never said that it was using the same hardware.
Exactly.
So yes, this announcement is real, but everything in it is all lies.
Oh, well, we're going to talk more about Project Reality once we get into another section, but hey, the arcades have still got us.
That's right. And it looks like Fun Expo attracts burgeoning family fun center biz.
Between September 30th and October 2nd, nearly 4,000 visitors attended the 3rd annual Fun Expo in Nashville, Tennessee. The trade show for the multi-attraction local family recreation center business crowd has some overlap with traditional coin-op game shows, but a much wider array of products, from mechanical bulls, batting cages, and even soft play installations were on show. The changing face of the coin-op biz, accelerated through the increasing size of cabinets and the dwindling number of street locations, makes a show like this an ever more important destination for the trade.
Yeah, I mean, this is really where the whole industry is going at this time, is towards the Family Entertainment Center, or FEC. We'll be seeing a lot of that in the trades, about how that is the format of the future. And certainly, growing up at that time, I remember that. I mean, I think there was an Aladdin's Castle still in my neighborhood. I can't remember if it was in the shopping mall, which is where you would expect it to be, of course, or if it was just nearby. But the places where I played the majority of my games in the 90s, not that I played arcade games very much, it was Centerfield Park, which was mini golf and batting cages and bumper boats, and it was the big laser tag facilities. That's where I was playing the games. Those were the places that were more and more hosting the greatest variety of them, and were attracting, that younger audience.
Exactly. I mean, you still had the occasional, like you said, in Aladdin's Castle or some independent small arcade in a shopping mall. But beyond that, a standalone arcade with just video games wasn't going to cut the mustard. Number one, if you didn't have some place to buy food, people weren't going to stay there long enough. If you were going to have it as a standalone location, how were the kids even going to get there? 'Cause from the suburbs, they needed transportation. Now you need to somehow distract the parents, or at least convince them that they weren't just going to go there to beat each other up in Mortal Kombat. All of these factors come into play, and this is where, well, everybody who's listened to the podcast at all, my experience working at Seattle Funplex. You can also check out my 2 interviews with the owner and manager of the location. That's this new business model. It's not just video games anymore, but this idea of paying for the individual attractions, the individual bite-sized bits of entertainment is still there.
Yep, absolutely. And of course, we go back to one of our more common stories throughout this year. Operators and manufacturers agree on violence in games.
During meetings of operators and manufacturers at the AMOA show, it became clear that the associations don't think the increasing amount of violence in games is good for the coin-op industry in the long run, but they also won't try to curtail it. The Best Game of the Show award went to Mortal Kombat 2.
But why, Mr. Head of the AMOA, are you selling all of these games that kids can play in their homes?
Well, and this is interesting. This month in the coin-op trade magazines, so many of the letters coming in and the commentaries are, well, we really, really don't like the image of this, but if I don't buy Mortal Kombat 2, the kids will go to my competitor who does have Mortal Kombat 2. And this really is a problem. And like we said in the first story, if you have street locations, you don't really have any other new hardware to put in there. I mean, even if you have an Neo Geo machine, all the new carts pretty much are fighting game carts. So it's becoming really problematic. It's what do you do? If you keep going with the violent games, you're getting the bad press that you didn't want. If you don't have the violent games, it doesn't matter because nobody's showing up to play.
Right. And then, as we just talked about in the last story, there's this move more and more towards family entertainment centers and attracting a slightly younger crowd that relies on their parents for transportation to the place, relies on their parents being there to get them to the place. And so that bad press can actually lead to potentially a drop in attendance in what are becoming the hottest new venues for the game. So they really are in a kind of damned if you do, damned if you don't situation where the fighting games are driving the profits and also threatening the profits at the exact same time.
And this was one of the topics that I discussed with in both of my Funplex interviews. And ultimately, both the owner and the general manager said that, it wasn't really a thought or didn't become a problem for them. I think that on an individual location basis, this is not going to impact them. Everybody's afraid it will impact them. But at the same time, for most parents, there's no alternative. There's no other place to go. And people are just going to get desensitized to the violence very, very quickly.
Well, and as is the case in almost all of these national political movements in the United States, the press and the challenges are generated by an infinitesimally small part of the population. I think, not to get too political here, but I think today of the whole book challenges and libraries nonsense, which they found like 90% of them are like in Florida, been driven by like 5 people or something like that.
Yeah.
So it's one of these things where even if there's a lot of heat in the national press, maybe there's only 1 or 2 places in the entire country where it's actually an issue and where some really dedicated advocates are generating all of that national press, which is why it doesn't become a problem in the larger, community so much, in the larger country so much, because all of the heat is coming from just a couple of small places.
Exactly. And I think that that's also what is going to happen here. And this is what the interviews proved. That they were like, ripping heads off, who cares? Didn't impact us. We had the little kids doing the whack-a-mole over here. They had the bigger kids ripping people's throats out. Nobody seemed to care. And I think that that's actually what is going to happen here. Now, like I said, the columnists and everybody had some interesting takes on this. Replay columnist Marcus Webb, very, very well known in the industry, also wrote for Next Generation later on. His column this month is dedicated to the issue of violence in games, and he quotes a, quote, top executive from a leading video game manufacturer who told Replay, and this quote, if you think today's games are violent, just wait. There's absolutely nothing to prevent factories from making games even gorier. On the other hand, there's a major financial incentive to turn up the blood and guts quotient. During the next 2 or 3 years, video game violence will become even more graphic, more photorealistic and lifelike. This will heighten the impact of violence considerably. I don't happen to like this stuff myself, but I'm sure our company will be part of the trend. In fact, I believe in the next couple of years, games will provoke such a public outcry that our industry will come under government censorship, such as recently happened in Australia. Frankly, if that's what it takes to tone down the violence, it's all right with me. And
old man yells at cloud.
Yeah, old man yells at cloud. And, you know, the funny thing is, by the time we get to Mortal Kombat 3, that gore factor will have turned into comedic factor.
Yes. Well, because you can only take it in one direction for so long before people get desensitized and tired of it. The market is always going to correct that kind of thing. Not always as fast as everyone would like, but it's always going to correct it. And then it'll swing back in the other direction again. I mean, it's a moving target.
Of course. And I mean, yeah, it really feels like everybody's afraid of that other shoe dropping. And I don't think it ever really does from a market standpoint.
No, I don't think so either.
No.
But, I mean, people are just kind of worried in general in the coin-op industry right now with everything that we have seen about how things have shifted, how the economics and the locations have shifted in the last couple of years. And so, I mean, that's really just where that's coming from. Just like with our next story, operators and manufacturers don't agree on revenue sharing.
The practice of coin-op game manufacturers owning the machines and operators splitting the take of the machines they manage with said manufacturers, aka profit sharing, has been a hot potato for a while now, and while many manufacturers have engaged in the practice to some extent, it was mostly ignored until Street Fighter Turbo and Champion Edition machines were given first to profit-sharing operators instead of those acquiring the machines on their own. While the manufacturers apparently are all looking at this model, but will probably wait until all the public scrutiny has passed, operators are worried that they will become little more than employees of the manufacturers.
Don't move to Japan, guys. You won't like it there.
So, just for those who aren't as deep into this, most of the time when you are an operator of an arcade machine or a coin-op machine, you buy the piece of hardware, you own it, and then you put it on in a location, and then you split the take 50-50 with the people who own the location, very, very typically speaking. And but you own the machine. What you do with the machine from that point forward doesn't matter. The profit sharing basically means that you're splitting the take not just with the location owner, but also with the manufacturer. But basically, you're either just paying a deposit on the machine up front, or you're not paying much at all for the machine. So yeah, you are more or less not an employee, but you're the middleman for the manufacturer who still owns the machine.
Yeah. And now I don't know this for certain. I don't have any source on this, but I think this has to be true. I imagine that Capcom did this as a means of trying to combat the widespread bootlegging and especially upgrading of Street Fighter II kits to other forms, other bootlegs. I think they felt that by keeping ownership of the machine, they could stop their operators from putting other people's boards in those Street Fighter machines.
I think that you are probably very, very correct. Now, there have been comments over the last year, because this topic keeps coming up again and again. And there have been comments in the trade publications about how While the Capcom situation has gotten a lot of press, there's a ton of manufacturers doing this on some level or another, either regionally or otherwise. So it's not as uncommon a practice. It's just, we've talked about this before. Street Fighter 2 is such a big thing. It's, as Ethan says, it sucked all the air out of the market.
Yeah.
That, you don't have the latest update of Street Fighter 2. Nobody wants to play your machine anymore. Type of situation that operators felt betrayed a little bit by this.
Right.
And so, yeah, that's, I think, where it's coming from. Plus, you always get the feeling these operators really see themselves as some kind of guerrilla fighters, super independent, libertarian types. We've talked about the conservative tone in the magazines quite often on social issues and so forth.
Well, and you know they aren't reporting all of their cash as income either. Just saying.
Definitely not. Definitely not. So this is why, it's one of those situations where I guess this is a business model that makes sense given how things are shaking out. But yeah, the operators see it as a threat to their business model.
Meanwhile, we get a blast from the past as the Maloneys are back.
The family of Bally founder Ray Maloney have decided to get back in the game under their family name. Maloney Manufacturing Incorporated has a 60,000 square foot facility for assembly and finished production and bowed several new games, including the Tapatuna rhythm game for preteens and, quote, The Redemption Shop, a standalone device that looks like a vending machine but is hooked up to 2 novelty games and will dispense prizes based on the points earned. This will allow even the smallest of game rooms to have unmanned redemption. Don Maloney, son of Ray, and 2 of his cousins are heading up the company.
Yep. Don and his brother briefly controlled Bally after Ray died, and then the whole thing was sold off. It's complicated corporate shenanigans. I won't go into them here. But yeah, I don't really know anything about this company or their products, but I will say that I understand the niche they seem to be trying to go for here, because redemption has gotten huge. It's gotten to be one of the biggest segments of the market because your rate of return on it is so high. They put in their quarter or even 50 cents or even $1, and the whole thing resolves itself in just a few seconds, and then they have to put in another one to keep going. Even the most difficult video game can't beat that rate of return. And it sounds like what they're trying to do is say, again, with the lack of offerings for smaller locations, not that a convenience store would ever do a redemption game, but smaller locations that can't fit big cabinets. A lot of redemption games are pretty large in size. And so it sounds like they're trying to find a niche for bringing the redemption model to smaller venues, which isn't necessarily a stupid idea, but I don't know enough about the company or the redemption market generally to say how actually stupid it was.
Well, it's a model. I don't know how many of these machines they actually sold. There's a full page ad for both, 2 ads, one for each of these 2 machines this month in Replay. I don't know about the Redemption Shop, how well it sold, but the idea that you would basically put it between 2 games, be it a video game or a skee ball or whatever, and if you got enough points, then it would drop out of product for you. Seems to me like a solution, like you said, for smaller venues, like a small game room in a pizzeria, or a small game room in a pool, not a pool hall, but a bowling alley. But it's going to be an expensive machine. If you're just handing out the little stuff like, rubber balls or something, that's not going to, I don't see the machine being for that purpose,
Right.
Nope, yeah,
that makes sense.
So yeah, and they claim, you can hook it up to anything, video games or whatever, so if you get enough points in Pac-Man, it'll pop something out. How exactly they're measuring that, how that's hooked up, I'd love to find out. I mean, how do you get the information about the score off of an old Pac-Man machine? How is that even supposed to work?
Yeah, absolutely. But understandable they want to try to push that, because boy, was Redemption big. I know when I went to arcades, I didn't go as much in the 90s, but definitely in the late 80s. I mean, every single one of those video games dispensed tickets, with, of course, which were custom solutions. They didn't come that way from the manufacturer. Everything dispensed tickets. Everything was about the prizes.
Well, and if you could do that with the games, then definitely there'd be a way to do this. I mean, I don't know enough about the technology to figure that out.
Yeah.
But, if those are options that are on the board someplace, then yeah, sure, why not?
Absolutely.
And yeah, Redemption, I mean, so many kids playing skee-ball just to get a few more of those tickets so they could get a little plastic ring that, you buy 50 of them for 50 cents. And, somebody blew $4 to have enough tickets to buy one. It's kind of scary profit.
It's all in the presentation. There was a guy in the 70s who got people to buy rocks.
Good point.
And speaking of trying to get and speaking of, you can convince people to buy anything, Virtuality goes public.
Virtuality Group PLC, the company behind the Virtuality arcade hardware, is set to go public on the London Stock Exchange on October 19th. Apex Partners, an investor, will control 50.9% of the stock, with 12% going to the director, Dr. John Walden. And his allies in Motorola and IBM will hold small stakes.
I know it's a little late for this particular stock tip, but don't invest in Virtuality, people.
But I mean, they're going to have a deal with Atari,
oh,
Jaguar. I mean, how can that not be a success?
What could possibly go wrong?
Where did you learn how to fly?
Yeah, there's this brief virtual reality craze, but it's not going to go anywhere, and then history will repeat itself. Exactly.
It's virtual reality. Enough said. But they're going to make it to the stock market, so more power to them.
Yeah,
it's really a sign of just how big the concept of virtual reality has gotten in the general public, that they can pull this off.
Absolutely. And that'll do it for coinop this time around. Moving on to console, we start with James Clark disses 3DO.
Silicon Graphics head James Clark was the keynote speaker at Entertainment, that's with an I at the front, 93, the Multimedia Industry Conference. He railed against 3DO, saying that their business model didn't add up, and their capitalization and stock valuation was all based on marketing, not on the advantages their hardware gave to gamers. The idea that 3DO would become an industry standard, according to Clark, has to be the result of someone smoking something. Obviously, this could also just be the result of his company's recently announced deal with Nintendo to create Project Reality, which, according again to Clark, is coming along so well that they may be able to release it before the expected 1995 launch date.
Yeah, good luck with that. But, here all I have to say is, why not both? Because, of course, he's saying this because he's working on a competing video game system, but doesn't mean that everything he says isn't true. Very prophetic here, though it didn't take a great prophet to figure this out.
No, and he's not alone. Game journalist Supremo Bill Kunkel, the OG game journalist, writes in his column in Electronic Games magazine this month, many developers have told him that they are waiting for software tools to help them make 3DO games. So, they don't have the basic tools yet for this system, which we've already talked about is on the market. In the meantime, the dev systems are just gathering dust.
Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, we've talked about how silly the business model was for the hardware, and that a standard just wasn't going to be a thing. So we don't need to belabor when we have so much to cover. But there's just a lot there. But you can't deny that the founder of this all is very convinced about all of this, or at least is very good at sounding convinced about all of this. And with all of these attacks going on, Trip Hawkins gets defensive.
With the 3DO system launched, the whopping $700 price tag seems to be causing some consternation. During his opening speech at the SIGGRAPH conference, held just 10 days before the launch of the Jaguar, Tripp talked about how radios cost the equivalent of $1,600 each in 1993 money, but quickly accounted for 35% of all furniture sold in the USA when they were launched. But, as Edge magazine points out, in comparison with the $200 Jaguar, $400 if you add the CD-ROM drive, which looks, according to them, like a toilet, that value proposition starts to fade. This is something Tripp is apparently very aware of, as he also takes aim at Atari by saying, quote, "Our competitors are just forming their alliances and making announcements. 3DO was at this stage more than 2 years ago. We're delighted that they've taken our launch so seriously, and they think our coattails are the ones that will provide the best ride." End quote. This may also have been based on the fact that Atari used Tripp's own words about having to put the performance difference so far out that no one bothers to compete at the top of their press kit for Jaguar.
Tripp, I know you're trying to channel your old boss and mentor Steve Jobs here in his reality distortion field, but you kind of left out the fact that there were no cheaper alternative to those radios, and those radios had something that you could not get anywhere else in terms of amazing content. That's what drives quick penetration. I don't think 3DO meets either of those benchmarks.
This is very, very true. And this whole idea of the alliances, this idea that, you need to have the proper alliances. No, you need to have the proper games. Mm-hmm. And this is where this whole thing, he's getting defensive. It's very clear in the magazines already at this point that everybody's just like, okay, what do we do with 3DO? What is the purpose of this? Granted, he's railing here against Atari, and Atari is starting to get reviewed. The Jaguar is starting to get these initial reviews because it's been revealed to the public. And Edge in the UK maligns almost all of the titles shown for the Jaguar. They do not hold back. It's a fun read. The only one that they don't malign is Alien vs. Predator, which I think everybody can agree is the best title on the Jaguar.
Yes.
The controller is also seen as a catastrophe that, especially in the age of Street Fighter II, with its 3 fire buttons on the front, which, by the way, Tripp, how many fire buttons does the 3DO pad have? And the big saving grace for the system may be its cost, as development systems cost only $9,000 each for the Jaguar, versus the 3DOs, which we already heard, the software tools are still missing, cost $30,000 each.
I know this joke is getting old at this point, but do the math. right there.
Yeah. I mean, it's at least the Jaguar's cheap to develop for. It may be horribly broken, as we found out from Leonard Trammell when I interviewed him.
Yes.
And they know that, but at least it's not going to break you as a developer.
But Carl, why all of this focus on Atari, which is also an also-ran? Did Tripp have nothing to say about his more serious competitors in the market?
Well, he did. And I think it's very interesting here that the keynote speech at Entertainment, which is basically consumer-focused, is the guy from Silicon Graphics, the guys who make the machines that make the movie graphics. And SIGGRAPH, the computer graphics conference, has Trip Hawkins, who is hawking a consumer device, giving a speech. There's worlds colliding here.
Little bit of Freaky Friday going on here.
Yeah. But no, Tripp, of course, can multitask. He did work at Apple. And he had some words for Nintendo's Project Reality, saying, quote, "Nintendo made their bed, and now they'll have to lie in it. They have proven to be a great toy company, but they are way out of position to compete in the new multimedia market. Even if they turn up the heat on technology, Nintendo isn't going to change its licensing practices overnight. They are still the evil monopolist, and we are the fair new wave." End quote.
I mean, Tripp has never made any secret about his absolute loathing for Nintendo's practices. And, I mean, they're deeply held beliefs. They're not just marketing speak. He really didn't like that stuff. Of course, turns out you don't need to have too many hot licenses if you just hire and employ the most amazing game developers that have ever lived right in your own company.
Yeah. Or you secretly hire really, really good developers and then sell it as your product.
Well, I mean, that can't hurt either.
Yes. So, obviously, what will Silicon Graphics actually deliver? It's a black box at this point. Nobody really knows what the specs are going to be. And so he is probably worried, any third-party developer developing for him is going to also be developing for Project Reality. As he will later find out, that won't necessarily be the case, but they won't they'll also not be developing for 3DO.
No.
But of course, we can't end this back and forth beef without going to the grand master of throwing shade in the video game industry. And so Nintendo head Hiroshi Yamauchi wasn't going to be silent on all of this, and at Nintendo's Space World show in Tokyo, where he also announced Project Reality, as we reported on last month, he gave us this month's quote of the month. Not doing it at the end of the show. Sorry, the beefs are too great. Any of these could have been the quote of the month, but this one takes the cake. He said, quote, "If you see our new machine, all you will understand what multimedia is all about. We don't believe in the idea of companies getting together to establish a new entertainment business. We need only one healthy, strong company as a leader." End quote.
That's so magnanimous of him towards Sony.
Yes.
No, obviously the PlayStation isn't out yet, and he is referring to his own company. It's just kind of funny because, it kind of turns out that way for a couple of generations, but it ain't you.
No. And this whole idea of what multimedia is. It's like you're going with cartridges, dude. They're digitized graphics and all that jazz is really not going to be your cup of tea. I mean, it's a lot of battle of the words until we actually see some hardware.
It is, and this Battle of the Worlds is Battle of Words is really starting to get people to ask, where's the money in interactivity?
A big takeaway from the Entertainment 93 conference seems to be that there is no way to make money off of interactive movies yet. A study showed that most computers in homes were at least 3 to 4 years old and would require expensive upgrades to make interactive movie experiences possible. The one bright light are games, but the biggest profits will be made by those that figure out a way to expand the market beyond its current preteen base. Jack Sorensen, director of business planning with LucasArts, said that, quote, people who do the work in technology and entertainment need to sit together for a long, long time to redefine the word game, end quote. He also admitted that only a 486 PC could even begin to play something like Rebel Assault, even though it was still years away from being as visually impressive as what is shown in movie theaters. And I think this really brings it to a... Now, granted, Rebel Assault will be ported to the Mega CD. I'll leave it at that. But, yeah, this whole idea of the interactive movie, something that Philips has been pushing with CDI for a couple of years at this point, which obviously Mega CD or Sega CD was not able to deliver. And now the question is, what are we doing? What is this multimedia thing? Because Yamauchi's talking about multimedia, but he's talking about 3D rendered graphics, real-time 3D rendered graphics. Trip, yeah, 3DO is mostly 2D.
But it says 3D right in the name, Carl. 3DO.
Yeah, about that. It's 3D, but not as you know it. I mean, it's, and you talked about this last month when we talked about Virtua Fighter and how that changed the view of Japanese game developers as to the viability of 3D graphics for game design.
Yes.
All these guys are talking about this stuff that they've been working on for years, but none of that means anything once you move to 3D.
Right.
And the question is going to be how many people will realize that fast enough or at least download a copy of Doom.
I think that number's going to get pretty high in a few months, Carl.
Yeah. Only problem is you still don't need a CD-ROM drive to play Doom.
No.
So the revolution will not be MPEG encoded.
But at the moment, the investors are still circling as King World invests in Crystal Dynamics.
3DO software developer Crystal Dynamics has sold a 10% stake to King World Productions, a major producer of first-run syndicated programming. This follows a similar sale of equity to Home Box Office earlier in the year. King World reps stated that the move will help put them at the ground floor of the multimedia revolution.
I mean, hats off to David Morse at Crystal Dynamics. I mean, it's basically free money, so why not?
Yeah, I mean, King World is a big player in this field. Amongst other things, they have Oprah Winfrey. The Oprah show is in their stable of programs. But yeah, the question is, what are you going to do? I mean, where is the confluence of these two things? And I think it really just shows nobody quite knows if this is going to work out, but everybody has FOMO. Nobody wants to be left out.
Absolutely. And we talked about the same thing in computer networks when we were talking about AT&T and Time Warner and all of them investing in various console modem solutions or the Sierra network or whatnot. Everyone knows that something is about to happen, that something's in the process of happening. They just don't know quite what. So they put a little money here, a little money there, so that they can get in on the ground floor. It's almost like big media companies are acting like venture capitalists, except that they're putting in a relatively small amount of money, so they don't have to worry so much whether they get a high return back. But they're basically acting like venture capitalists by spreading the investment around a bunch of different networking and multimedia companies and seeing until they see where the future takes them.
Yeah. But at the same time, they're not really shooting for, they're not doing the big swings. They're all seem to be investing in add-ons or companies that are already working on existing technologies. I mean, that's the difference with the venture capitalists. Yes. It's, we're going blue sky. I mean, the stuff you're developing doesn't exist yet.
No, absolutely.
And I mean, it's also probably partially because virtually all of these companies that are doing the investing are publicly traded or at least large enough that they can't just make these big bets without having to report it to somebody.
Nope. They have to wait for the .com era before they can start going wild. And that's going to go great.
Yeah. Pets.com. Okay.
AOL Time Warner.
Yeah. Who gets first billing? The first one to leave. No.
Indeed. But everyone is still pushing this, and as the technology starts maturing, we are starting to get our first kind of standards in the multimedia space, and in recognition of that, video CD logo coming.
Matsushita, Philips, Sony, and JVC have agreed on a name for the commercial standardization of MPEG-1 based video on CD. It's called Video CD. While no current consoles support the standard, decompression add-ons are expected for CDI, CD32, 3DO, and Jaguar.
Yeah, I mean, and this is basically a move to kind of counter CDI. Not that CDI is ever more or less relevant, but there was a time when the CDI standard was thought to be the future of multimedia. And of course, its big Achilles heel was that it couldn't do video. So now they're basically trying to promulgate a new standard in multimedia around this video CD marketing. It's the kind of stuff that today nobody really cares about. But back then, it was a big deal, all of these tech companies trying to come together and create these standard. I mean, I suppose the last time we really had a kerfluffle around this kind of thing was the Blu-ray versus HD DVD format war. But
well, there's also another factor here, and I just today finished listening to a German podcast called Stay Forever. I highly recommend it to anybody who speaks German. They did a whole long episode about the history of CDI. And one of the things that we have to think about here, and I never really thought about this, was that Philips and Sony and these other companies that were very big in CDs realized that when this new standard CD came in, that there was an unbelievable business in reselling the same content to people a second time. So people who had bought their ABBA records or whatever on vinyl bought the same damn thing again on CD. And if this MPEG thing works out, all those VHS tapes that they've been selling people over the last 10 years, we're now 10 years into popularization of VHS as an item you purchased. We talked about it with Wrath of Khan being one of the first budget-priced VHSs. That there's this real sense that if they can pull this off, people will rebuy all those VHS movies as video CDs.
Yep.
And that is why this push is there. That's why all these guys have come together. Philips had developed their own slightly different format using the same compression standard, or a very similar compression standard. But now they've all agreed, okay, we're going to go with this this format, this video CD format, but it requires more processing power than the CDI has. So these add-ons are not just, code. They have to have a whole separate processor just to make this possible. And as we'll see when PlayStation arrives, I don't think the PlayStation could play video CDs, if memory serves me right, but it could still play MPEG-1 video. So they didn't pay the licensing fee to do that, I don't think, but you could play the video because the processor was strong enough to pull it off.
Right.
But here we're still dealing with, the CDI has a slower 68,000 processor than the Amiga from 1985 in it. So it's insane.
Yeah, truly. But exciting news, Carl, because we're getting our first look at CDI Zelda.
The first screenshots of the Zelda games on the CDI have been released, and well, it looks promising with full animation, beautiful, put beautiful in quotation marks, hand-painted backdrops, and the promise of Nintendo playability. I know, seriously, there's like 4 magazines I looked at this month that all had screenshots. Curiously enough, not different screenshots. So clearly they were grabbing the screenshots themselves, or Philips just made a mother load of screenshots available to everybody. Some people are already extremely skeptical of the games, even in the tiny blurbs that accompany the shots, because some of those full screen animation shots already look deplorable, because I don't think that they're streaming as video, because obviously the FMV add-on's not there. So it's, some kind of line work being processed over a still image background. If you're listening to this and you've never seen that, please pause this right now and Google it, because you need to understand the situation that we're in, where enough people were still excited by this. The whole idea of having full screen animation on a interactive device is still novel enough that you think that this is a good idea. And once you've seen it, you will know that it clearly is not.
Yes.
Yeah. When did you ever see this at the time?
I did. I don't have strong memories of seeing the screenshots and whatnot, but I absolutely did. I was aware of this at the time and saw this in the magazines.
Yeah. So the first time I saw it was not in a magazine, but the first time I saw it was actually in a demo unit in a department store or an electronics store in Germany running. And I just looked at it going, what the hell is that? I
never saw it in action. I never saw a CDI demo unit. I'm sure those were more prominent in Europe than they were in the United States, just because Philips being Philips. Where were you at the time?
Well, I was in Germany in '94 when I first saw them.
Right.
But then later on, I saw them again at Sears. Sears had CDI, at least the ones in Seattle that I visited, had CDI demo units very, very late still. All the way into 95.
That's fascinating.
Yeah. And it did not get any better with age. It just kept getting worse.
Yes. And, maybe that's why with all of these ridiculous competitions over standards and formats and multimedia, that Sony just decides to go it alone.
Sony has decided to put aside collaborations with other players like Nintendo to bypass letting others make hardware decisions for it, like Matsushita is doing with 3DO, and won't be designing hardware in tandem with others like Sega is doing with Hitachi. Instead, they will be making a no-frills game machine using CD-ROM. Through a new joint venture between Sony Corporation, which purchased UK publisher Psygnosis in the summer, and Sony Music Entertainment Japan, and the new company is going to be called Sony Computer Entertainment, which will officially launch on November 16th with a capitalization of $4.4 million. An ever more crowded market A late 1994 launch in Japan and 1995 launch in Europe is planned. Analysts are skeptical of Sony's chances, though, in an ever more crowded market given their lack of distribution relationships in the industry. But Sony believes that a recent shift in market focus from game machines with fast processing microchips to those featuring better video image quality will give them an edge. Sony further elaborated that their system would focus on 3D images previously only available on high-end workstations, which will limit the amount of data that would have to be loaded from CD-ROM, an existing bottleneck of current systems.
I don't know, Carl. I don't know that this is a good move by Sony here. It is an awfully competitive market.
I was actually astonished when I saw this. This is an article. This coming from an article in Billboard magazine, and I think it was because it was coming from Billboard and not from some general news source that this idea of identifying the bottleneck in the system really, really makes a big difference, and the idea that they were going to go alone actually doesn't come from the Billboard article, but from a Japanese article about this, because they're obviously more focused on the relationships between these Japanese companies.
Of course.
And so, yeah, the fact that they're like, hey, all these people are fighting over, how much data can you get off the CD-ROM to put onto memory, to put on the screen. If we just go to 3D models, this is nothing anymore. This is not a problem. And they're giving it away. I mean, they're literally just telling everybody, this is the secret. This is the secret sauce. And guess what? We're going to launch in 94.
And they execute. One of the things that is so incredible about Sony, I mean, they do so many things right. I love the quote from Trip Hawkins that he gave once where he said, he would have hoped Sony would have made more mistakes by now. That'll be a quote of the month sometime when we get there. Is that unlike all the other companies, they held their promises. We're going to launch at this time with this many titles. Then we're going to launch here with this many titles, and we'll have this many titles by this point. And at every step along the way, they do it. Yeah. Which is just astounding when you look at, Sega and Nintendo.
Well, I think it's primarily because they had a clear vision of what their games were going to look like. There's no 2D hardware in there. I mean, right. And we talked about this in a previous a jump many years ago, but if you look at Castlevania Symphony of the Night, it's the perfect example of this because it's a 2D game. It looks brilliant as a 2D game. You're like, this must be, moving sprites around. No, it's just it's a 3D texture on a 2D plane. Moving means you can move it anywhere. You can zoom in, you can zoom out, you can do whatever you damn please with this. You can twist it. You don't need extra animation frames. You dramatically cut down all of your effect budget. And what happens when they convert it to the Sega Saturn? Well, now you've only got one plane on the Sega Saturn because they're still thinking in planes. It's just a continuation of the Genesis hardware. Only one plane can do transparencies. So, one plane has a transparency, all the other effects now have to be, little dots. You want to move stuff around as 3D objects? No, that doesn't work. You could do it as 2D sprites, because the Saturn can do 2D sprites like nobody's business, but now you have to reprogram the whole damn thing. They don't do that. So now you get this mess of a game that's running slow, doesn't look as pretty, and you're like, no. They figured it out. They looked at the problem, they figured out where the solution was, and they decided we're cutting everything else that's not important out.
Absolutely. Oh, and let me tell you, I'm reading ahead here, and I know you said that the other one was the quote of the month, but I think this is the real quote of the month right here.
We can have two. We had two last time. Let's do it.
This is too precious. Go right ahead, Carl. Go right ahead.
Okay. Sega of America head Tom Kalinske, when asked if Sony's announcement of a 1994 launch would push Sega's launch plans up, said, quote, "The only thing that will affect the plans for our system is making sure we have enough quality software if the timing is correct and if the price is right."
And it's 1, 2, 3 strikes you're out at the old console game.
Okay, sorry. Your retort to this was much better. I was going to go with whoever guesses whoever gets closest to the right price without going over.
I mean, oh my God! Because of course they screwed up the software availability, they screwed up the timing, they screwed up the price, and they let Sony's announcement push up their launch plans. It's just like, oh my goodness.
Yeah. This really is a cluster.
And I mean, Tom Kalinski's such a well-meaning guy. We shouldn't make too horrible fun of him. And, some of that stuff he wouldn't have done if it was up to him. Some of it really was forced on him by Japan. So he's not entirely responsible for the fact that this quote ended up being so horrendous. He was overruled on some things, but still, that is just a howler in retrospect.
Oh, definitely. I mean, it's... Yeah, and this is the wonderful thing about, being a... not backseat driver, being a Monday morning quarterback, 30 years later. I mean, yes. Obviously we know from a time perspective what this all means, but it really does show that these questions are being asked by the journalists. And this is coming from a magazine called Consumer Electronics. I mean, we're dealing now with very, very specialized, because these are the people who focus on, manufacturing costs, and all this stuff is part of their imagery. And yeah, they're not ready. These guys are not ready for this battle. Tripp still thinks, the controller from the Genesis, where EA was so successful, is a good idea for the 3DO. All these things, they're just not ready for somebody who's going to say, we're cutting ties with the 2D past.
Yep. Exactly. Because, I mean, Sega, it's been overblown, how unprepared they were for 3D, because they were prepared for the transition, but they thought it would be a transition. They thought that there weren't enough developers that knew how to do it. So even if they put 3D hardware in, it wouldn't be used to its full potential. So they were like, we have to make this a transitional system where it does sprites really well and does 3D well enough and gets developers starting to become familiar with this. That's probably even part of why they did the 32X, was to try to start building up that capability. They did not understand, ironic since it was their own arcade game that showed us the way, they did not understand that the future was here now.
Yeah. Well, I mean, come on, they still had a cartridge slot on the damn Saturn. I mean, and that, I just love that line from Sony of, this is the bottleneck. We've solved the bottleneck.
There wasn't a cartridge slot on the Saturn.
Yeah, there's a cartridge slot on the Saturn.
That's not for a cartridge. That's not for like a game cartridge.
But you could have used it for a game cartridge. I mean, I know they used it for the memory expansion and for the modem. But you could have easily put a game on that if you wanted to. I just don't think anybody ever bothered.
Yeah, I suppose it's an open question as to what their intent was with it, whether they really thought they'd put cartridges in it. But anyway, that's a digression. That's a digression. It did have a slot, and that slot did accept things that looked very suspiciously like cartridges. I do grant you that.
Well, and this is the thing that there was actually, I can't remember if it was this month or last month, but one of the magazines was talking about how, speculation was it was still going to have a cartridge slot.
Right.
Because, can you really trust the market,
Right, and they did have a prototype that did not have a CD drive. That was Jupiter or whatever.
Oh, here
I think.
I'm finding something now. Granted, this is off of Quora, so I'll take it with a huge grain of salt. But apparently, there was also a Tamagotchi for Saturn, which also used the cartridge slot.
Ah, that wouldn't surprise me.
Yeah. Yeah, this is just kind of insane.
But none of this is really important, Carl, because the winner has arrived. Sony, Nintendo, 3DO, Jaguar, they are all irrelevant as Commodore preps US CD32 launch.
At the World of Commodore Amiga Pasadena show in early September, Commodore President Jim Dion announced that, quote, "We feel confident CD32 will become our next 64," end quote. With 20,000 units per week being produced and an estimated 75 titles ready for Christmas, with, according to VP of Engineering Lou Egebrecht, quote, "without Commodore investing a single dime in the software development," end quote. There haven't been any allotments of CD32s for the US market yet, though, even though the machine was launched months earlier in Europe. Some attendees were offering up to $1,000 for the display units. But don't worry, as early as Christmas, Commodore may release CD drives for the A1200 and A4000 that can do everything the console can as long as a new version of Amiga DOS is finished.
I'm assuming he misread his teleprompter, and he was supposed to say, "We feel confident CD32 will become our next +4 instead of 64."
No. Confident and what will actually happen are two very different things. Yeah. So the fate of the CD32 in North America, as we will see in the next couple of months, has to do with the fact that there was a patent dispute concerning the CD drives or the CD software. And so they weren't allowed to launch it in the US, which scuttles all of that possibility. The fact that they're bragging that, they didn't have to invest anything in software because 75 titles were immediately available. I don't know what the licensing model was that Commodore set up for releasing games on the CD32. I don't know if they even had a licensing model. That's something that we'll still have to do some research on. But yes, those games are not what you would call CD32 exclusives at this point.
No.
There will be a couple, but not many. And and those CD drives for the A1200 and A4000, spoiler alert, will not appear from Commodore.
No.
So, this is not going to go well, as we will see, since Commodore is, next year this time there will not be a Commodore, but that's
Indeed. Also, fun fact, Lou Egebrecht is the unsung true father of the IBM PC, who has been essentially cut out of the story because he left IBM under acrimonious circumstances, so they just never promote him.
Oh, really?
Yeah. This is the guy that's really the father of the PC. Him and a couple of other guys working up in Rochester that got the whole thing rolling, and he was the chief engineer on the first PC. But then he left the company, and nobody was happy, and so they always focus on Lowe and Estridge, the executives, rather than Egebrecht, the engineer.
Oh, man. Have you interviewed him?
No.
Oh.
I believe Brian Bagnall interviewed him on his Commodore days for his Commodore books, but didn't talk to him about IBM. I'm not sure if he's still alive at this point. I mean, he certainly was as of a few years ago. I just haven't looked, recently.
Yeah, according to LinkedIn, he's retired. Then again, LinkedIn isn't always great with deceased personalities.
No.
But might be fun to try to get a hold of him. That would be a cool interview.
Absolutely.
Okay, another one for the list. So many of them at this point.
Yes.
Okay.
But absolutely. But as Commodore stock continues to plummet, Wall Street bullish for a certain value of bullish on Atari.
The prospect of Atari's Jaguar being a hit has buoyed Atari stock, rising from a low of $4 a share in September to over $10 a share on November 3rd. The much lower price of the $250 console in comparison with the $700 3DO may be a key factor in this evaluation.
I mean, I realize on a percentage basis that's a huge jump, but still, 4 to 10 isn't going to get my blood pumping too much.
No. There was some talk, though, that given that amount, that change, or better said, around this same time, Jack sells a huge chunk of his Atari stock to Sam. This gets noticed by people in the press, but New York Times is very quick to point out, I mean, this doesn't look like insider trading. It looks more like estate planning.
Right.
Which it pretty much is. I mean, he's selling the stock to his son, but it also, means that there's a tremendous amount of stock moving relative to the company size. But yeah, so trust me, these prices will not hold for a while.
No. And despite the bravado from Mr. Kalinsky a little bit earlier, it looks like generation transition concerns an issue for Sega.
That's right. Electronic Gaming Monthly has a write-up on early information emerging about Sega's next console, the Saturn. The chipset made by Hitachi is speculated to be a modified version of the 68030, same one that is also showing up in the Amiga 4000 and I believe the 1200 as well at this point, which, while related to the Genesis's 68000, will not be backward compatible. This lack of compatibility with Sega's current generation of formats means that some developers have already worry about the Sega CD becoming a lame duck in the Christmas 1994 season as gamers put off purchases in anticipation of a mid-1995 launch. The mag also speculates that given the current cart and CD combo of Sega's 16-bit offerings, that the Saturn will run both carts and CDs.
Yeah. No, some interesting weirdness in there. This, I think, is largely rumor, which was often a problem in the magazines at the time. I mean, we don't have Next Generation out yet. Because, I mean, I'm not an expert on who ripped off whom in the old chip business, but I don't believe the Super H line of Hitachi processors are Motorola 6800 series knockoffs.
And this, I don't think so either. And again, they're using as sources developers.
Mm-hmm.
So I mean, it wouldn't surprise me if it was maybe somebody like Core Design maybe helping them out here, since that would be one of the few Western developers that's still doing a lot of work with the Sega CD. Mm-hmm. And we're talking, I mean, these interviews would have been done months before, so we're probably talking September at the latest. But they're already worried about Christmas 94 because we are talking about longer and longer lead times for these products. So no matter what the case may be, the idea that the Genesis won't be backwards compatible the way the Genesis was with the Master System. Because, I mean, obviously nowadays backward compatibility is sort of something we accept, but at this point we're coming from a generation where the Super Nintendo was not backward compatible with the NES, although it had been long speculated that it would be.
And was probably meant to be, because why else use that absolutely dumb processor?
Exactly. It was clearly meant to be. I mean, they also talked about it. So This question of, okay, if the Genesis, it's not going to be backward compatible with the Genesis. It's not going to be backward compatible with the Sega CD. And I think that the reason why some people thought that the Sega CDs would run, I mean, cartridges, you can't fit an NES cartridge in a Super NES slot.
Yeah.
But CDs are CDs are CDs. CDI was supposed to be a standard. 3DO is supposed to be a standard. You know, why wouldn't you be able to run your Sega CD games on the Sega Saturn?
Oh, you sweet summer child.
Exactly. I think that there's... I'm only guessing a little bit, but I think there's a serious element of that in the thought process here.
Yeah.
Especially given that, you know, Sega CD is still a relatively expensive add-on. You know, if you're saying 2 years out from buying this thing, it's already going to become obsolete. It seems like what reasonable hardware manufacturer would make something knowing that in 2 years they're going to be superseding it? I mean, 2 years. It's just imagine if somebody did it even with less time than that before making it obsolete.
18 months? What? Yeah. No, I think you're right about all of that. That makes perfect sense to me.
Yeah, I don't know. But this is why I included this, because that whole cartridge slot, is it a CD drive? What's the standard? There's a lot of unease, and the developers need to know where to put their resources, especially because game production costs are becoming so expensive. This is what they were talking about in entertainment. It's like, how do you make money off of interactive? The production cost to fill those 640 megs is so big. What do you do?
Yep.
So
sometimes you just have to slice through the Gordian knot.
And you're just like, we're doing 3D and that's it.
Exactly. But back to the current generation as Nintendo extends Super Mario All-Stars giveaway.
Nintendo of America is extending through year-end its free with purchase video game promotion and will boost ad spending for it by 50% from $10 million to $15 million. Nintendo is offering consumers a certificate good for a free copy of the $59.95 Super Mario All-Stars with each purchase of its $149.95 Super NES Super Set.
You know, I think this might be slightly related to our next story, Carl, which informs us that Nintendo sales and profits down.
Down? Now, I mean, in our 40-year jump, we were just talking about their profits were up. Now, Nintendo Company has released, so this is Nintendo of Japan, has released their April to September numbers, and sales were down 6.2%, and unconsolidated pre-tax profits were down 23.9%. The company still turned a net profit of 32.51 billion yen, though. The forecast has called for a slightly larger dip in profits, but this still marks the first drop in 10 years. A sluggish Japanese economy and the strong yen appears to have been the main culprit, hitting exports hard, especially in Europe, where sales have been sluggish. The Super Famicom/Super NES product would actually have a sales decline year on year for the first time since its introduction in 1990. Nintendo has also announced that they have suspended plans to produce games on CD, as they had not produced enough software for such a system. The fact that Nintendo is not a player in the movie industry, unlike Sony and Matsushita, may hurt it going forward, with FMV becoming an ever more important element in video games. This despite the fact that, according to the Japanese Trade Ministry, which reported that the Japanese video game market grew by 13% to 411 billion yen in 1982, while the audiovisual market shrank by 12% to 371 billion yen.
Yep, so we are in a perfect storm of market conditions here that basically almost crashed the video game industry again. We don't have to go into all the larger macro. I do have a podcast episode on this, the crash that wasn't. But yeah, there are some real headwinds in the business right now. And even though Sega is crushed more by them because they don't have the capital reserves that Nintendo does, Nintendo ain't exactly sitting pretty at this exact moment either.
No, I mean, the fact that they're estimating they're going to have that the sales of the Super NES are going to go down. I mean, we're only 3 years into this product. 2 years if you calculate the North American release. And already sales are dipping, is not a good sign for them. And the fact that they have to give away Super Mario All-Stars, which should have been like their big Christmas sales killer, is not helping them. The fact that they no longer, despite what Trip Hawkins said about them being the monopolist, can no longer stop companies like Capcom from releasing Street Fighter 2 on the Genesis. It means that they are now in a position where they're going to have to now prove their value again to the consumer outside of just, well, we're Nintendo, what else are you going to do? And this idea also, and this is also why I like this article that I based this, that I got these numbers from, the fact that the audiovisual market shrank. This goes back to what we were talking about earlier about this hope of companies like Philips and Sony that people will replace their VHS collections with video CDs. We're still a couple years away from DVD. Is because that market is shrinking. Everybody's got a VHS player at this point. Yeah, they're going to buy more software, but that doesn't mean that they need more hardware, and the hardware is where the big revenue is for these companies. And this real speculation that, well, if FMV is necessary for the next generation of games, companies that own movie studios or have television production are going to have a leg up.
Exactly. And, which is why Sony buys Columbia in 1989, for instance, is this idea that software is going to supplant hardware.
Exactly. I mean, of course, that all paid off for them because we all know how great the FMV sequences in the first Resident Evil were. But yeah. But yeah, so Nintendo is not doing well at this point.
No.
I mean, they're still making a tremendous profit. So
yes, they're doing fine in that sense, yeah. But they're not doing as well as they're accustomed to. And as I intimated earlier, the competition is going to be doing so much worse. But first, we have a little expansion from the competition to talk about as Sega begins manufacturing in Wales.
Yes, Sega has awarded its first non-Japanese cartridge manufacturing contract to Welsh company AB Electronic Assemblies. While they have been making hardware in various Southeast Asian countries, cartridge production had remained in Japan. The new arrangement should help limit their exposure to high Japanese labor costs and the high yen, as well as cut down on transportation costs.
Yeah, Europe is just a disaster right now for the video game industry, which is particularly problematic for Sega, which needs that market more, or those markets. I know it's not a single market. Needs those markets more than Nintendo does, because Europe is in a full-blown recession. And so the strong yen driving up the price of things is a real absolute problem. And to compound this, they are in a price war with Nintendo right now in Europe. So at the very moment that prices, quite frankly, need to rise to remain profitable, they're doing their best to drive their prices down.
Yeah.
And this is creating a nightmare situation. We already talked about how sales are particularly sluggish in Europe for Nintendo. You know, Sega is having even worse problems there because they're so dependent on it, which is why move more manufacturing over there and do what they can to mitigate how they're getting reamed in currency exchange rates.
Exactly. And I mean, we're not done with the exchange rates yet. Those stories are going to be continuing, but you're right. I mean, they need to do something. And Nintendo is still doing everything in Japan, or virtually everything in Japan.
Yeah.
They have very little manufacturing outside. Sega had already moved a lot of stuff to Taiwan, for example. But
but now, even though theoretically, presumably Taiwan is a cheaper market to manufacture in than Wales, though I'm sure Wales is pretty cheap compared to the rest of the UK. No offense to Wales, but it is Wales. Even that isn't enough anymore. Things are so bad that, you know, moving to Europe, where manufacturing is probably, I don't know this for sure, but probably slightly higher, is worth it for the savings in the shipping and transportation and distribution costs.
Well, also, you don't know how much higher the yen is going to go.
Right.
I mean, we've talked about this last month, how all the Japanese manufacturers had to adjust up because they had planned out their forecast with the yen being at a certain level, and it kept going higher, and nobody knows how much higher it's going to go. If it keeps going higher, then at a certain point, those yen they're paying the manufacturing staff in Japan will outstrip the cost of labor in Europe.
Exactly. And, you know, and it's clear that nobody knows where this is going to end, because if they agreed to this, the Japanese government agreed to the economic trade deals that led to this. If they had known, they knew it was going to strengthen the yen. That was the whole point of these trade deals. But if they had known it was going to do this to the yen, there's no way in heck they would have agreed to those trade deals. The economy got away from them, and spoiler alert, that's going to be a real problem. It's already a real problem, but it's going to be even more of a real problem, not just for the video game industry, of course, but for an entire generation, the lost generation of Japanese citizens.
You could argue it still hasn't ended.
Yes, you very much can.
30 years later, we're still feeling the effects of this.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And so no big surprise at all with all of this. Sega downgrades forecast.
The stronger yen has now hit the house of Sonic. Sonic has made its forecast with 110 yen to the dollar exchange rate, but its drop to just 107 yen will affect the bottom line, and they expect the exchange rate to drop to just 105 yen in the second half of the fiscal year. This, coupled with an expected plateauing of 16-bit sales in the US and a collapse of 8-bit hardware sales in Europe, makes even the upbeat news that Sega claims to be about equal to Nintendo in terms of hardware shipments in the US and has a market share in terms of sales of more than 60%.
Yeah, it's disastrous. And we've talked about this before, and I've talked about it on my podcast. We don't necessarily have to belabor it here, but the difference between Sega and Nintendo, there's lots of differences. But one of the big ones is Nintendo has a real viable, strong home market. And Sega, in its console business, is almost entirely dependent on exports.
Yeah. And so everything Nintendo sells in country, the yen is not an issue.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, the yen is okay because they still have to import a lot of the raw materials to make those cartridges, and they're buying those with very strong yen. So they have an advantage. But yeah, Sega, and especially because Sega was still hawking the 8-bit Master System in large chunks of Europe in a big way, that market is finally collapsing altogether, which means that they don't really have anything to replace it with immediately. The Saturn is still at least a year away.
Exactly.
And they don't have a chunk of the handheld market, which would be price equal, or they have a chunk of it, but not a big
enough chunk of it. Yeah. I mean, the Game Gear's not a failure in absolute terms, but as something that can serve as the Game Boy Advance and the DS did for Nintendo when their consoles were in the dumps, it is not that. Just because it's not a failure doesn't mean it can replace lost Master System and Genesis revenues.
Exactly.
So, yeah. And those new high costs are not just impacting the console manufacturers, it's also impacting the third parties as well, as EA suspends SNES lineup.
Due to the high price of the yen, Electronic Arts has announced a stop to their Super NES releases in Europe, as Nintendo is demanding to be paid in yen for carts. This will force third-party publishers to sell their games for more than £50 each in England, while Nintendo continues to sell their own games for just under 40.
Yeah, again, it's those currency transactions. They want to bring yen into Japan, which benefits them, rather than other currencies that they would have to change into yen, which absolutely hurts them. But don't worry, guys, don't worry, because I am told that EA resumes SNES lineup.
Nintendo has acquiesced and agreed to accept payment for carts in dollars, so EA has decided to resume shipments of games just in time for Christmas. Now, this is weird because both of these announcements are in the same issue of Computer and Video Games, the British magazine. And they even explain that, on one of the earlier pages, this announcement came that EA was stopping the sales. And then later in the magazine, they're like, okay, we got this right before press time. Okay, they worked it out.
Yes.
So this is how
good news, everyone. Yeah. But it's understandable that Nintendo would cave on this, because even though Electronic Arts in this period is more thought of as a Sega-aligned company, which is true, EA was a particularly strong third party in Europe. Specifically. They had a very strong European branch. Of course, they had hits with European games such as Populous. And I think that when Europe is already looking pretty bad, I think losing EA support in Europe would have been pretty darn harmful for their holiday. It makes a lot of sense that they would have to cave to EA on this.
Oh, definitely. I mean, and the fact that CVG is reporting it this way, I don't think that they would have gotten those details like, Nintendo's selling their games for this and we have to sell our games for this. That sounds like talking points coming straight from EA.
Oh, I'm sure. I am sure.
And the fact that it got out into the press, I mean, we can't underestimate how important the magazines are at this time in Europe, and how many magazines are selling in comparison with the number of carts being sold. It's basically everybody who's buying a cart is also buying a magazine.
Yeah.
So, this can definitely have a major impact on the buyer's perception of of what's going on.
But even despite the hardships, the console war must continue unabated as Sega decides to crash Mario's Big Bash.
We talked last month about how Nintendo had launched a new ad campaign in England featuring comedian Rick Mayall. Well, it turns out that while cheerleaders were dancing around and karate chops were on display in the big Nintendo party in the Arc building in Hammersmith celebrating the ad campaign launch, Sega projected a massive Sonic the Hedgehog on the side of the venue.
Oh, those cheeky gets. Those cheeky gets.
And this is the kind of stuff that would not happen in the States. But yeah, the console war in Europe has a slightly different tone.
Yes, it does.
Yeah, just couldn't help myself when I saw that. I was like, that's cool. I couldn't find a picture of it though. I'm sure somebody's got to have one, but.
And meanwhile, in software, ad games on the rise.
The increasing prominence of games as a mainstream form of entertainment, especially for impressionable demographics, coupled with increasing visual fidelity, is making games an ever-increasing target for marketers. With games based on the Cheetos Cheetah and Ronald McDonald set for release, many marketers are looking for synergies.
Yes. It was an age of mascots and mascot games, Cool Spot, Yo Noid, the various McDonald's games.
Yeah, it's really kind of crazy that it's almost like the slow death of physical toys and the slightly older demographic meant that your licenses for games had to also get older, and so teenagers, they're not buying action figures, but they sure are eating that junk food.
That's right.
Yeah. So on a side note to this, Matsushita, makers of Panasonic and Gold Star 3DO machines, has been approaching companies to produce games for their Japanese 3DO launch. Among them, ad agency Dentsu, which has experience in advertising and film production, and Hakuhodo, a company best known in games for their advertising game for a brand of mayonnaise called Wonder Kitchen. So, yeah, this... Now, if you've checked out Wonder Kitchen, it's not really much of a game. It's really terrible. But
how does the mayonnaise taste, Carl? How is the mayonnaise?
I have never tried it, so I do not know. But yeah, so the idea that they're approaching these guys to try to bring in game development just was an interesting synergy. It's like,
yeah,
you really understand entertainment, Mr. Matsushita.
Yeah. And moving on to some legal issues, we have Nintendo wins big in South African courts.
Nice attempt at the accent there.
It was an attempt. I fully admit that.
Nintendo has won a massive suit against 15 South African retailers selling pirated Nintendo games imported from Taiwan. The retailers will have to hand over the illegal merchandise to Nintendo and pay their attorney's fees. So this is part of a larger issue in the third world countries, and this is really where we have to put South Africa at this point. Where in South Africa, mainly because of the apartheid era bans, there's really not a lot of official trade in these kind of consumer goods. So what's happening there is very similar to what's happening throughout South America and other parts of Africa and so forth, where you're not going to get the officially licensed goods, but there's a lot of these pirated versions, especially NES clones, popping up everywhere. And the fact that they're getting the South African courts to recognize this and to fight it is already quite impressive. Now, how much it's really going to shut it down is hard to say.
Absolutely. And meanwhile, on the software side, the pirates are getting more sophisticated as well as console game pirates start to train.
This month's crack column in the German mag Amiga Joker talks about the growing wave of online piracy in regard to console games, with many claiming to offer complete sets of games for systems like the SNES, and going so far as to build in trainers and cracktros like those found in the computer game cracking scene. The pirates are not limiting themselves to games, though, as books are also beginning to pop up as downloadable files. Yeah, the internet is slowly arriving, and with it, a new industrialization of the piracy and wares trade. And this is really where I gotta say, and we've talked about it on the show before, but the crack column. It's a one-page column every month in Amiga Joker magazine talking about the demo scene, demo parties, but basically, efforts by the police to go after hackers, people, pirating software, which groups are doing what, things like this. The fact that this is showing up in a magazine, it's pretty much our only print view of the scene that's not just reporting, the cops got this much stuff. And it is I'm very, very thankful that these columns exist, that we have access to that data now.
Indeed. For this next one, I will try to capture the spirit of the headline here. Pad computing more of an than an ah!
Thank you for interpreting my words so eloquently. The New York Times has a nice opinion piece on two of the major pad-based computers released over the last few months. The Apple Newton and the Casio Z7000, also known as the Zoomer. Nothing to do with the generation. Neither one truly impresses with poor screen legibility, laughable attempts at handwriting recognition, and little apparent practical use. The reviewer is quick to point out, though, that this format seems to be the wave of the future, and if you can work out the quirks of using them, like the on-screen keypad or AOL connectivity via phone line on the Zoomer, then maybe there is something to be said for the devices. And one thing else that they say about the Zoomer, which I thought was very, very interesting, was that because it has some additional buttons on it that can be used for playing games, that you could almost say you don't need to take a Game Boy with you anymore once the right software becomes available for the system.
Mm-hmm.
Which I think, the reviewer really does give this sense of, yeah, both of these devices are garbage, but the form factor is right. The idea, if you get the networking up and running, of this truly being useful makes sense. It's just way too early.
Pretty much.
Yeah. And of course, typing with a stylus is just not a good fit. And handwriting recognition on these things is still terrible.
Yes.
And there's one other cool thing that he mentions, that the Newton apparently is always trying to find the closest word in its limited vocabulary, whereas the Zoomer just tries to recognize individual letters. So the number of mistakes is not as bad. So, there might be a letter in the middle of the word that's wrong, but the rest of the word still stands. Whereas the Newton will just basically find the next nearest word. So now you have to not just correct one letter, you may have to redo the whole word and hope that it guesses it right the next time. So yeah, real pain in the ass.
Absolutely. Moving on to the main computer industry news, Big Blues chronicles fall of IBM.
Wall Street Journal reporter Paul Carroll has written an extensive, anecdote-rich account of the fall of IBM from the dizzying heights of 1980's record-breaking profit to their record-breaking losses in the 1990s. Missed opportunities as well as inside views on their failure to move beyond mainframes and the already doomed OS/2 paint a picture of a company that has lost its way.
Of course, unlike so many of the other stories that we've been reporting on with companies like, say, Commodore, the reports of death are rather greatly exaggerated because just recently a fellow by the name of Lou Gerstner has become the CEO of IBM, and boy, are we about to go on a ride.
Yes, IBM has many, many more lives left in it.
And the interesting thing is the turnaround is just about to start under Gerstner.
And that is one of those interesting moments in time because everybody at this point is like, okay, if you don't control the PC market, you're dead. Mm-hmm. And there are other aspects, especially if you have to suddenly set up servers to run the internet.
Uh-huh.
Maybe there's... that's why the idea, they couldn't get past the mainframes.
Yeah.
We're about to see that you're going to need this thing that looks a lot like a mainframe called a server.
Mm-hmm.
And there's not that many people who know how to build those and have the experience and the patents and all the other fun stuff.
Yep. And if they can get a new CEO that can really focus them on a specific area and focus on execution, maybe there's something to be done there.
They may actually execute somebody.
Yeah. But this is a point in time. I mean, this article is not wrong because this is a point in time where it did look like IBM was about to go, dead. And I mean, this is the exact same period of time when DEC is falling apart, when CDC is falling apart. It seems like all of the old dinosaurs, even though IBM reinvented itself in the PC era better than those other companies did, it seems like this is the period when all the old dinosaurs are about to go extinct. But of course, not so in the case of IBM.
No. Speaking of old dinosaurs.
Yes. And now we have AI puts help desks on disk.
HP is one of several companies adapting to the new, highly competitive, low-margin computer business by trying to move their customer service to AI-powered programs packaged with their products. Using a type of AI known as case-based reasoning, they have distilled common problems with their printers to plain language, which the programs can then sift through when users have issues. The hope is that millions of dollars in customer support costs can be saved, and HP estimates that 20% of the problems users encounter are now solved through this software.
Just a nice reminder that no matter how often we think that AI has arrived as the future, they haven't taken over the day jobs yet. I know it's much more impressive now than it was in 1993. I'm not,
No. But
I'm not unsophisticated, but just a reminder that the AI revolution is supposed to have been coming for a very long time. It just hasn't always been as highly publicized as it is being today.
Exactly. And I mean, the concept nowadays of having, the help files, the help menus for every Windows application isn't a thing yet.
Nope.
It's not there yet. It's there now. I mean, right now I'm staring at Audacity recording my audio in the background. I see the word help. I've got my browser open over here. I see the word help.
And the canned AI response help stuff is mostly useless anyway because it's fine for common problems, But for the kind of problems you and I have, where we understand that you start by trying to turn it off and on again, is, far more specialized stuff. So whenever I'm running into a problem with Windows or with an application on Windows, I just immediately go and start searching the internet for forum posts where people have described the same issue and the solution. I don't use any of the help stuff that comes packaged with my computer programs.
Well, and that's the thing. I mean, those help menus aren't really using any AI. They're basically just a list. They figured out that extra layer doesn't really help.
Yeah.
And you're right. I mean, once you use one of those wonderful servers to search for stuff and you find somebody else on the planet at some point has already written about what you want to do, because there's nothing new under the sun, including computer problems.
Mm-hmm. Meanwhile, in components, Smart Tech bets on dual scan.
The increasing need for GUI interfaces on portable computers has created a very competitive market for color LCD display technology. Laptop maker SmartTech has introduced 2 new laptops that use a dual scan system, which is meant to reduce the blurriness caused by the relatively low refresh rate of single scan LCD screens by having the screen be divided in 2 halves and refreshing both halves simultaneously. The effect isn't nearly as sharp as TFT screens, but would be made obsolete by better TFT screens by the early 2000s.
Yeah, I mean, it's a blip on the radar, in a way here, but it's just reinforcing again a little bit of what we even talked about with things like the Newton, that there's the real blocker right now in a lot of ways is the screen technology and getting legible and usable screen at reasonable price. And, once that's solved, maybe we can do something. But right now, the only portable computer anyone cares about is a Game Boy.
and that's got a notoriously terrible screen too.
Exactly.
And so, this is why I included it, just to show that everybody is struggling to figure out, how do we make this GUI driven portable networked computer future multimedia thing work? And there's just all these components, but the pieces are still missing to make it all fit together.
Yes. But yeah, we're starting to see all of these threads, and eventually we'll be able to weave something out of them.
Yeah.
But in the meantime, we can stop to talk about what I would consider personally to be a rare multimedia success story of the period, as Broderbund announces Living Books.
CD-ROM is encouraging a revival of the bookware movement, and Broderbund, a major player in the educational software market, has teamed up with Random House to bring several kid-friendly book properties to the PC.
Yeah, now, I mean, I never experienced these myself because by 1994, I was old enough that, I was out of those kind of books. I was almost a teenager. But my understanding from the sources I've read is that these were truly outstanding productions that were very popular and very successful. And, I think they went about it the right way, because multimedia at this point is too primitive to impress or wow the teenage gaming audience, even the tween gaming audience. You do kind of have to get them while they're very young to make multimedia seem impressive at a time when everything feels like magic. And so targeting the really early childhood market, as they did, with a well put together multimedia product based on a strong brand, was absolutely the way to go, which is why, as I said, this is one of the few multimedia success stories of this period in computer games rather than failures.
Oh, definitely. And I mean, considering that it's coming from Broderbund, that has such a history of focusing on the quality of that interactability with the product. I mean, we saw it with the Carmen Sandiego series. This is just the right relationship.
Mm-hmm.
It's not going to last, obviously, but it is an interesting side note that this worked.
Exactly. And moving from the sublime to the ridiculous in multimedia, Shakespeare does karaoke.
British software publisher Foss CD has released Karaoke Macbeth, a CD-ROM that allows users to choose a part to play in the Scottish play and then plays the sound of actors performing all the other roles with still images and a text box to guide the action. Unfortunately, the product is a bit crap, as reviewed by the British TV show Bad Influence, as the text has been incorrectly typed in right in the first scene.
Well, bollocks.
Yes. There's literally a typo. It's supposed to be the word one, W-O-N, and instead on screen, the word one, O-N-E shows up. So, it's... When I first read about this, there was a New York Times article that mentioned it, and I was like, you know what? That actually sounds interesting. I want to know more about this. And then I found the Bad Influence thing on it. I was like, this still looks interesting. And then the typo comes up, and the lady, I can't remember her name, she's the co-host of the show, she just rips into it. Like, what the, Yeah, so, Karaoke Macbeth. Don't bother.
Yeah. Moving on to some other software companies, Commissar becomes CEO of LucasArts.
Former Apple and Go Corporation executive Randy Commissar has taken over as CEO of LucasArts, the games division of George Lucas's Lucasfilm empire. He is the third and final division head hired as part of a major restructuring of Lucasfilm. Commissar comes in as LucasArts is celebrating that X-Wing looks to become the top-selling PC game of 1993 and a plethora of new Star Wars licensed titles, among them Rebel Assault, Super Empire Strikes Back, TIE Fighter, and Star Wars Screensaver are nearing their launches.
Yeah, I've talked to his his successor as CEO, the previously quoted vice president of business development, Jack Sorensen, and he says that Commissar did absolutely nothing in the less than 2 years that he was there. Obviously that's just one person's opinion on it, but I imagine that's true.
And this was kind of the reason I wanted to include this. This idea of bringing in non-games people to run a games company, just because he had been at Apple and Go. It almost felt like, well, those are technology things. This is technology thing. Let's put technology guy in with technology thing. Yeah.
Yeah. This one did not work out. I don't think he particularly hurt anything while he was there, but he also didn't help anything. If I'm remembering correctly, it's been a while since I've listened to that interview, but if I remember correctly, he said that he basically spent most of his time trying to look impressive to his superiors rather than actually accomplish anything.
Yeah. And I mean, it's a time when LucasArts is almost on autopilot because it largely becomes the house that churns out Star Wars.
Mm-hmm.
And it's also, in many ways, the beginning of the end of their original output and any kind of impetus to expand that original output.
Yeah, and the other thing is that as Lucasfilm has grown, not that it's ever becomes a gigantic company, but it has grown, as evidenced by this reorganization of the divisions. We're about at the point, and again, this comes from Sorensen. They're about at the point where they've lost the ability to have direct contact with George Lucas. I mean, they never had much direct contact. He's not a gamer like Spielberg. It was always just a nice thing on the side, but there was always this sense that if you really needed to get something to him, you could. And Jack says that just because he had been there long, because he joined in, I think, 91. I mean, he had been around since before that transition, that he had still a little bit of that ability to move up the chain when absolutely necessary, but that it was kind of rapidly disappearing at this time.
Yeah, and I can totally imagine, and that's probably also part of that major restructuring that was mentioned in the articles. I mean, yeah, the question, I don't know what Lucas was planning on doing with the company at this point. I mean, Star Wars has already been dead, essentially, in the mainstream for 10 years. There's still the book publishing is going strong. The Timothy Zahn books are out there. Are they already talking about episode 1 or what will become episode 1 at this point? I think so. We'll get, in the next 6 months, there will be an interview in one of the magazines with Mark Hamill in relationship to Wing Commander 3, where he will mention that he's heard that Lucas is working on another Star Wars and he's not sure yet if he's in it. Mm-hmm. So, it could be that, but, I don't know enough about the history of LucasArts to know exactly what went on before this reshuffling on the corporate level.
Yeah, absolutely. And moving on to some hardware, it is definitely time to upgrade as Logitech goes 3D with the Cyberman.
Mouse maker Logitech has introduced the Cyberman, a new controller that looks like a multi-button mouse mounted on a pedestal. The controller registers movement on the X, Y, and Z axis and has a motor for force feedback. Several major software publishers have endorsed the device, including Access, Bethesda, Sierra, and Electronic Arts.
Did you notice that little Doctor Who reference I dropped in there?
Oh, the Cyberman?
Yeah, because you got to upgrade.
Oh my God, I didn't catch that. Oh.
Time to upgrade.
Good. Nice point. Yes. It's late, people. It's very, very late. Okay. So, did you ever use one of these?
No, I did not.
I actually got to do an in-store demo of this thing.
Oh, wow.
Oh my God, I could not get it to do jack and or doo-doo. It was so finicky. Oh my God. Yeah. Pain in the butt is really what I'm trying to say.
Sounds like. So, maybe Electronic Arts shouldn't have been so quick to endorse that particular thing. But they do have some other endorsements that seem pretty darn solid as Larry Probst sees software download future.
Larry Probst told CNN's Stuart Varney that the expansion of the information superhighway into homes will bring many new services in 3 to 4 years, including the download of games like John Madden Football. How much will such a service cost? Probst doesn't know, but the value proposition of such a download will be an interesting thing to see develop, but he doesn't foresee downloads replacing physical purchases. Instead, a model similar to movies with cable delivery being the final method in the commercial life of the product. Varney pokes a bit at EA, which has a projected yearly revenue of $400 million, but a $3 billion valuation. Probst counters, though, that the company has a big growth potential.
Obviously, he's off on a few of the particulars here, but still the understanding of how online connectivity is going to massively change the game space is something that Probst has been quite prescient on here.
Oh, yeah, and this is why it really caught my attention that, he's 3 to 4 years, he's obviously early. But the idea that the games would first be sold individually and then later on become part of basically a subscription service is very much the way the games industry has been developing for consoles and PCs.
Exactly.
And it is interesting because, EA Origins, have they introduced a subscription service on there yet?
I don't know. I try to ignore EA Origins as much as I can. But that's a good question. Does EA Origins...
I think Ubisoft has theirs. So...
Yeah. Origin Access Premier. They do. They do have a subscription service. Yeah, no, it's a thing that happened. And EA has always been pretty high on online and always been pretty high on trying to control online, knowing where that's going to be a major revenue stream. Of course, their first attempt, EA.com, in the late 90s was a dismal failure. But they were the last holdout on Xbox Live of anyone that mattered. When Microsoft was trying to get everything into their unified online ecosystem, EA kept saying, actually, we're going to keep our own servers. Okay, thanks, bye. And they finally, I forget what exact concessions they finally had to make, but they had to fight them real hard to get them into the Xbox Live ecosystem. And, of course, they tried to run Origins as a Steam competitor, which was hilarious.
EA has always wanted to be the biggest dog in the pound, but it's when you're not the hardware manufacturer, it's always an awkward position.
That's right. Unless you're Valve or Epic, apparently, which figured out ways how to dominate everything in software. This whole Fortnite as a platform thing this has nothing to do with today's topic, but this whole Fortnite as a platform thing is going to be very interesting to see how it plays out, because that is a fascinating new way to try to leverage a popular game into something bigger, into a bigger ecosystem.
I'm curious. Roblox has its place, but what do you do with Fortnite? How do you adjust that?
Well, but that's what I'm saying. They're using Fortnite as an umbrella. They have the Lego game now. They have the rhythm game. They're not actually Fortnite, but they're all part of the same. You log into quote unquote Fortnite and you have all of these different styles of play you can do. It's kind of like almost the Sierra Network in a way all over again, except with stuff that it's already been proven that people like and want, like the game Fortnite itself and, like Legos. So it'll be really interesting to see where that goes. It's not going to become like the new Steam or whatever, but it'll be really interesting to see what that turns into. Maybe it's the first step of the Oasis from Ready Player One. I don't really think it's the first step towards that.
No. It is an extremely interesting idea, and it reminds me of a musing by Peter Molyneux that we talked about a few years ago here on the show, where he was talking about, having some kind of universal standards so that you could build a city in SimCity, then import it into Populous, and then fly through it in a flight simulator. And I just don't see. I'm actually in the middle of an interview right now. It's going to be a very long one. And the interview subject, we've talked extensively about the difficulties of, for example, just adapting something like the Unreal Engine to very specific gameplay styles, and how unbelievably complicated that is to make it really do what you want it to do if you're not doing a first or third person exploration game.
Mm-hmm. No,
and this is why I don't buy it. I just don't buy it.
Well, it's not going. Yeah, no, it's not going to be the thing that takes over everything, and I don't believe that for a second. But I am interested to see what it does become and what it means for future platform models for software developers, and whether it will allow, to a certain extent, some of the software developers to divorce themselves more from hardware platforms because they're able to create their own software platforms, whatever that means. I mean, it's not going to be some all-encompassing, this is now our world, this is the oasis. But I'm curious to see where it goes.
No, me too. I mean, all of these things, all the big developers need to now reinvent their business models. Because online has changed everything. The death of physical has changed everything. And how do you make money if you have to constantly churn out essentially a new game through content? Instead of you make the game and now you wait for the money to come in.
I mean, there's a reason Activision Blizzard was just sold, and it's not Bobby Kotick's, sexual harassment Activision culture scandal, because they could have waited that thing out just fine, thank you very much, if they had wanted to.
Yeah, no, the model is new. The model is dangerously destructive. I recently heard something like the average person, the average game development staff member only stays in the industry for less than 5 years at this point.
Yeah.
The burnout is too great. The model needs to change. The expectations that there will always be more and more and more content that you're not paying full price for is not sustainable. And now with AI generated content that's flooding the system already, and by this time next year it's going to be a deluge.
Yeah.
Sifting through quality and not quality, finding the games you're actually going to want to spend time on, is going to mean that virtually every game is going to be a loser financially.
Well, I think that's also why this whole basically platform curation thing that Microsoft is pushing so much is about one of the only ways to start really combating that. I mean, they still have to figure out the economics of, like you said, how do you give away games, AAA games for free as part of a service and anyone make money on it? That has to be figured out, but it comes down to, you can't just go on Steam and find a gem for yourself anymore. You need someone like Microsoft to curate a catalog, which is what Microsoft does with their Game Pass stuff, essentially. Is, here's some catalog curation, play all of these games as much as you want for free, and if you particularly like one and want to keep it long term, then buy this one game at full price or wait for the next sale and buy it, 90% off, whatever, and you have it forever. But, there's a reason we're moving towards that, and we've suddenly gone from being a video game history podcast to a video game analyst podcast. So we should probably get back on topic here.
This is true.
I hear wireless email is taking off.
The growing dependence of people on email is making email on-the-go solutions an up-and-coming business. Byte Magazine highlights 3 such hardware-software network solutions for wireless wide-area network connectivity. Granted, they are still fairly boxy plug-in modems that allow laptops to access email over wireless networks run by individual providers, but there is talk of such modems being reduced to easily inserted PCMCIA cards in 1994, and maybe wireless email will soon be as widespread as cell phones.
Ah, man, I remember PCMCIA cards and the dongles that came off of them, because I had laptops in the late 90s, early 2000s.
Yes. My first laptop, I bought it for law school in the year 2000, and the wireless adapter was a PCMCI card that stuck out of the middle, and halfway through my second year, it started to pop open. So you saw the component, it was just sort of this weird open mouth, like a little miniature alligator sticking out of the side of my laptop.
Ah, those were the days.
Yeah.
But again, it's just this another sign of the times that everyone sees these technologies coming. Everyone understands that there needs to be a solution for the average consumer, and everyone is making their attempt to add their little piece of the puzzle to our current overly connected hellscape that we live in today.
And also, this is a wonderful contrast with some of the others, quote-unquote, solutions that we've seen. Here you have a technology and people are figuring out themselves how useful this email thing is for them. And now we're trying to find solutions. Well, how do we make it even more available to them?
Yeah.
Whereas so many of the multimedia question was, well, we have this technology. We want people to adopt it without asking the question, what is the added value? What is the use? Mm-hmm. So here we have technology chasing a need as opposed to technology searching for a need.
Absolutely. But all of this explosion in interest in the internet does mean that free lunches on the internet may be coming to an end.
The New York Times reports that the exploding number of new users crowding the information highway, known as the Internet, are beginning to cause serious traffic jams as people hear through electronic word of mouth about new databases and flock to them, causing the computers running them to shut down. Some experts predict that the only real solution will be to make the services only accessible against payment.
I miss the early internet, Carl. Now, I know it's partially rose-colored glasses. I know that there were useless GIFs everywhere, that people thought dark blue on black text or yellow text on a gray background were like acceptable choices to make people read. I know Alta Vista was useless because you had to put like 50 not statements in to stop yourself from getting nothing but porn results. But, you know, there was something nice about a day before banners, pop-ups, JavaScript nonsense, and paywalls. There was something nice about that.
Yes, I totally get it. Now, the worst part is we're not yet at the point where you can even put in a background color. Remember, this is still this is barely mosaic at this point.
Yes, I was not on the internet quite this early.
Yeah. So, I mean, when they're talking about access to databases, they're talking about access to databases, as in somebody put a whole bunch of files that you then had to sift through.
Yep.
Now, among the many discussions is a recurring theme about how to monetize the quote-unquote open architecture of the superhighway, with many providers discussing the cost of bandwidth of such a structure, while others are discussing the potential fear of common carriers aka phone companies, getting into the production of content and slowing down speeds for competing content, and yet others voicing concerns that when viewers can freely choose what to watch, that those with extreme views will live in isolated information bubbles, eliminating the First Amendment principle of robust public debate.
No, there's no way that could happen, Carl. Is there? The internet is a force for good.
I just love the fact that we're in 1993 and it's every single problem with the internet has already been clearly identified and expressed in all its detail. This is a real pain in the butt.
Yeah, there's not a lot I can say here without keeping this nice and even keel on this lovely podcast that you graciously allow me to co-host. So let's just leave that one there.
I'll say it.
I know you will.
They've set it up as as an extremism. What do you call it when you spin that equipment you have in a lab to spin stuff around to separate the elements?
Centrifuge.
A centrifuge. It is an extremist centrifuge where everybody gets pushed into their little corner and then you just basically watch something like the Hindustan Time all day long. The only element they're forgetting here is the algorithms, because they're still talking about word of mouth moving people in one direction or another. The fact that process is going to be automated without the direct input of another human being was not yet in the cards.
And that was the true disaster.
Yeah.
I mean, literally. There was a study done on how Brazil became so far right, and they were able to strongly correlate. I don't think they quite said causation, but they were able to strongly correlate the introduction of algorithms in the Brazilian market by YouTube, recommended viewing algorithms by YouTube in Brazil, to the dramatic shift to the far right that Brazil took after that.
Oh, of course. I mean, the moment that you have this thing just constantly suggesting something, it's not even text. You see the pretty pictures, and you can just basically all day long. And now that YouTube is being bombarded with AI-generated content.
Yes, exactly.
That means you can never actually even get close to running out of new material.
Well, yeah, and that's the problem, because we're susceptible to that. It's kind of confirmation bias, but it's not, because we're not talking about you already having the belief. You can come into something with no opinion of a belief, and if you watch one thing that says something outlandish, you'll often be like, oh, that's ridiculous, ha. But if you watch 3 or 4 things in a row, all with people saying the same thing, which the algorithm allows you to do, then a lot of people just start to believe despite themselves. But anyway, we are also not a current web problems podcast. We are a video game history podcast, and I'm told that Renegade ports to interactive TV.
Tirton Interactive Television claims to have developed a way of providing streaming games over a phone line that uses the buttons on a standard landline phone as a game controller, with results equal to those of a console game. They have teamed up with publisher Renegade and already implemented it with the game Magic Pockets, with plans to do Xenon 2, the Chaos Engine, Sensible Soccer, and more.
And if you believe that, I have some lovely coastal property in Florida that I can sell you after you pick up your interactive television system.
Yeah, I looked high and low to see if there was any example of this anywhere. I mean, I'm not saying that they're just pulling this out of their butts, but it sounds like they're pulling this out of their butts.
Also, I presume, I could look it up, but it's more fun this way. I presume Magic Pockets is a pool/billiards game.
No, it's actually a jump and run game with this little chubby kid dressed, with dark sunglasses, a hoodie, backwards baseball cap, as is wanted to be in the early 90s, and he's pulling out these magic stars out of his pant pockets.
Oh my. Well, that's not appropriate. But that negates my point. I was going to say that I note that they started with a game that doesn't require constant real-time action, and they're only promising in the future all the games that do require constant real-time action. But that doesn't matter anymore because this boy is pulling stars out of his pants.
Yeah, these are all basically Amiga games.
Yeah. Oh no, I know the others. I know Xenon 2. I know the Chaos Engine. I know Sensi. I had not heard of Magic Pockets.
Yeah, it's a game that you don't really need to have heard of. It's a Bitmap Brothers jump and run game that sort of looks like. I just imagine a poor man's Mario with the graphics from the video game Gods. That's what it is. I mean, it's really nothing to write home about.
Lovely.
Yeah.
Well, speaking of pulling things out of pants, it appears sex sells.
Really? This is news to me.
Yeah, details at 11.
Several publications are dealing this month with the growing issue of sex in multimedia products. Improvements in graphics and CD-ROM storage capacities are beginning to make adult entertainment a growing source of income. Reactor, the American studio responsible for Virtual Valerie and the upcoming Donna Matrix, see this trend as a long-term one, and Trip Hawkins of 3DO has said that the company will not be regulating content on the platform at the same time as CDI is beginning to receive more content with a decidedly sex appeal-based bent, such as the game Voyeur.
And that's why 3DO managed to sell anything at all in Japan. And I think I did this once before on another topic like this, but to paraphrase a Monty Python joke, I object to all the sex on the multimedia platforms. I mean, I keep falling off.
Yeah. This is one of those questions now of who is your target audience when you're selling a $700 black set-top box? I mean, it's clearly not kids, so when do you move into the proper adult setup?
The 3DO is really rather great.
Oh my god! Oh, okay. You did the voice there brilliantly. But yes, and I gotta ask: have you ever played Virtual Valerie?
I have not. I've heard of it, but I have not played it.
Oh! It is an experience. It actually makes, or let me put it this way: in typical Mac fashion, it's less playable than sex games on the Commodore 64, and it's quite terrible. And it only gets worse when they did Virtual Valerie 2 because they moved from hand-drawn art to pre-rendered 3D models of the time, and it's just like, why is this character made up of individual round balloon shapes that seem to sort of fit together? It's quite terrible on all levels. So.
Delightful.
Oh yes.
And meanwhile, cable news fuels tech stock roller coaster.
The New York Times reports on how mentions of stocks on cable news channel CNBC can cause raucous fluctuations in the value of stocks, with discussions of the stocks often light on facts and heavy on enthusiasm, made early in the day can cause stocks to jump up, leading to reports on said jumps hours later, causing even bigger jumps. Two examples are given. One, semiconductor maker Bomar, which is barely profitable, and Atari, which saw its stock jump dramatically after CEO Sam Trammell discussed his excitement about the first successful test of the Jaguar console back in March. In April, the company had announced a 10-to-1 reverse split, a move indicative of flat prospects for the company, and Sam bought 4 million shares at 94 cents each from his father Jack. The reverse stock split was canceled shortly thereafter, together with the Jaguar launch announcement. At this time, Atari is trading at over $11 a share. And this is a report from the 7th of November.
My birthday. And, yeah, so, meme stocks were a thing before the internet.
Yeah, and this is the reason I wanted to include this, because in the next couple of years, we're going to be entering the dot-com boom. The next couple of years, we're going to be seeing this huge jump in the tech sector because of all these devices, the problems with the LCD displays, the problems with the internet, and so forth are all going to be solved, meaning that there's going to be a lot of excitement around these stocks. And it's interesting to see right here the mechanism of those kind of massive fluctuations, the role CNBC is going to play in all of this cannot be understated.
Now, if you'll excuse me, I have to go and buy some Bear Stearns stock right now. I hear they're hot and just going to keep going and no way they can fail. Not before I get me some
of that good old-fashioned Enron stock. I mean, they're going to have an open trading floor for bandwidth. You know how that's going to go.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, Jesus. Okay.
But back to something slightly more video game adjacent. Well, that was Atari, so it was also video game adjacent. But video games move into museum.
The American Museum of the Moving Image in Astoria has opened their Hot Circuits exhibit of video games. The show displays a plethora of games organized in chronological order, starting from 1971 to the present, ending with modern machines such as the 3DO and their promise to combine the existing art of movie making with video game interactivity.
Capturing the zeitgeist of the day for sure.
Yeah, this is why museums should stick to history and nothing older than 20 years. Or nothing newer than 20 years.
That's right. Absolutely. Yeah. And, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say, it's kind of cool to see, video games starting to get this kind of recognition, even if it is the Museum of Moving Image, but still this kind of recognition.
Absolutely. And then on a sad note, we have to say rest in peace to one Tom Quinn.
Former Sears Sporting Goods Department manager Tom Quinn, who stocked Atari's Pong unit when most weren't interested, helping launch the home video game industry, has died at 63. He later would play a role in the founding of Activision, iMagic, and Suncom.
Yeah, it's one of those that's so sad that he died so young, because there wasn't a lot of interest back then. So nobody, to my knowledge, ever interviewed Tom Quinn. I mean, not even like a journalist, or because, some people did get interviewed back in the day too. But as far as I know, nobody ever interviewed Tom Quinn on his role in helping foster the home video game market. And it was a substantial role because he was one of the few people that thought that these things should be sold in stores. And he tried to get Magnavox to let him sell the Odyssey. And they bent by letting him sell it in the catalog in 1974, but would refuse to let him put it on retail shelves because they had their authorized dealer model that had worked for them so well in the 50s and was working less well for them in the 70s. And so, he and Atari end up connecting with each other. And, that wasn't the start of it. There were others before and this and that and the other, but it was a major milestone when Sears was advertising this thing. It was a major milestone to getting the American public interested in this product because Sears was the retailer, bar none, at that period of time.
Oh, definitely. I mean, Sears, JCPenney's, and Montgomery Ward. The big three at that point. I mean, Kmart, I think, starts moving up that ladder a little bit later. But. Yeah,
I mean, they're the big three, but that's almost like saying, IBM DEC and CDC were the big three. I mean, Sears was, they had their own real estate company. They had their own bank. And, there's a reason that what was at one time the tallest building in the world was at one time called the Sears Tower.
That's true. I mean, which other company would be big enough to still have CDI displays in 1994?
There you go. And, even by the 80s, this was fading more, but in the 70s, it was Sears and it was everybody else.
That's true. That's true.
So... Yep. So he played a big role, and I wish we could have learned more about it from him directly. But someday we'll invent the real video game newsroom time machine, and then we'll do that.
It would be fascinating just to get a real insight into, retail. Internal retail politics at that time.
Well, now I've talked to a few people that were involved in that. I mean. I have talked to two people that were at Sears at the same time, both of whom are now dead, Dick Lehrberg and Ron Stringari. And, of course, Al Nilsson was at Penny's in the early 1980s, and Jim Skoroposky, co-founder of Acclaim, was at Macy's. So I have talked to a few people a little bit about how all of that worked. But, in fact, Stringari was in the room where it happened when the deal was struck, because he was a high muckety-muck at Sears. When this home Pong deal was struck, and then went on to Atari. And he just passed away last year. Myself and Kevin Bunch, Atari Archive, who's actually the one that found him and then interviewed him first and passed him along to me, found him just a few months, I think, before he died. So that was...
Oh, wow.
That was good. I mean, I'm sorry he died, but it was good.
Yeah.
But let's move away from the depressing topic of death to the glorious topic of birth, as Maniac launches.
German console gaming mag Maniac, the I is exclamation mark, launches with an iconic Sonic vs. Mario cover image, as well as a screenshot of the now infamous CDI Zelda animation. 30 years later, the mag is still going strong, but now rebranded as M Games.
I am glad to hear that the cover market got a little better between our 40 and 30 year jumps here in Germany. I'm glad they've upped. I'm glad the cover game has been upped.
You mean it's not the two least attractive people in the world spooning each other together with a Commodore 64 and scanty clothes? No, yeah, I'm very sorry to disappoint. Yeah. But Maniac is a magazine. Like I said, it's still going today, which is
even I've heard of it.
Impressive bits. And it's also one of the first magazines to be purely dedicated to console gaming in Germany. Which again, it shows that slow shift away from being an almost exclusively computer game market.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And yeah, I mean, like I said, I've even heard of Maniac, even though obviously I have never made reading German gaming magazines part of my regular routine. So may
there you go.
May they make it to 40 and outlive their Spanish compatriots, or not outlive, for they've already outlived them, but live longer than
break their record.
Their recently deceased Spanish compatriots.
Yeah, we'll see. We will see. There's only one way to know, and that is to live long enough to see it happen. But
so here's hoping we see that happen too, Carl.
Yay! I want to live forever. Okay, but that brings us to an end today. We have nothing else. We've done our quotes of the month, so that just means we have one final function to fulfill, and that is, Mr. Alex, what is the word of the episode?
Well, I definitely think there can be only one word of the episode, and that is correct timing. As mentioned by Tom Kalinske in his delightful quote, we have had so many things here that are either way too late to do any good or way too early to do any good. And we have a lot of predictions about things that are going to happen. We have a lot of predictions that are actually going to come true even, but the timing is just all over the place this month. And it was definitely not a month for much correct timing. So maybe incorrect timing is what I should say rather than correct timing. But either way, that is my choice. And since it is my divine right, it will be so.
I will totally endorse that as our parting shot for the eternity of it all. So please remind everybody where they can find your fine work, sir.
As always, it is They Create Worlds, the podcast, the book, the musical, the toilet paper, all that. Podcast.theycreateworlds.com or theycreateworlds.com for the overarching website. We recently did a two-parter on ball at the time of this. We recently, at the time of this recording, did a two-part episode on the development of ball and paddle games from the dawn of man, I'm not kidding, all the way through Arkanoid, and we'll soon be turning our attention to Alone in the Dark.
A very important game in this whole 3D versus 2D discussion that we've been having.
Indeed.
So I definitely look forward to that. And then everybody else, remember you can support us on Patreon. Check out the extra material. And I've got nothing else. It's almost 2:00 in the morning now. I am finished. So everybody, have fun.